everyone. Hello. Hopefully you can hear us. If you can, please let us know really fast. We would really appreciate it. Hopefully you're all having a good day. We're not live on YouTube yet. Come on, YouTube, wake up.
Wake up, YouTube. Pirate Day.
Only it actually was, then I'd feel very clever.
Yeah, it would be pretty good, but sadly, no, that's not the case. So hopefully you can all hear us out there. Can you also tell us if our volumes are approximately equal? If not, we will twiddle some buttons on this side before we get started.
Okay, we should be. What is taking so? There it goes. Jesus, God, that took forever. All right,
a bit slow today. Okay, there we go.
Hello. Please let us know if you can hear us and stuff. Hopefully you're all doing well. We just, give me some random emotes, spam some emotes in chat or some R's because we are getting into some pirate goodies today. This should be okay. YouTube's looking good. Twitch, make it look like y'all are alive. Okay, good. Y'all are there. Awesome. I will note before we get into it, I do want to say before we really get going that yes, I know Creative Assembly just put out the patch notes. I'm very excited to go over them. That'll be after the stream because they've released them at 11 and it's going to take me at least an hour. So I was like, oh, fuck it. We'll do it later.
Also, I'm feeling terrible today, so if I doze off like a zombie, you all know why. I had one hell of a night, but let's not discuss that. It is, however, super appropriate for the topic today, where we are obviously discussing the Vampire Coast. And again, just to double check out there, can you hear us both clearly, and are we about the same volume? Because if we're not, we'll do a quick twiddle. But if we are, I'm apparently super low, does it say there?
Yeah, let me know. Yeah, be sure to let us know if Andy is too quiet.
How about that? Does that make me a little bit noisier? Do the old pool micing thing.
I mean, from my perspective, it sounds the exact same.
Well, there you go.
Let me just let us know. Sounds good? Okay, some people are saying
audio's good.
Okay,
alrighty. Okay. So if that all sounds good, I'm good to go if you're good to go.
Yes, I think we can kick off.
Okay, so before we go, our classic...
Last thing I'll say, sorry, is that I'm aware there were some super chats that came in for yesterday's stream. I have those. So if you're those two people, I got you. Don't worry.
Good, yeah. So we've got a couple of things to say. As always, number one, if any super chats come in, we'll be taking them in batches, which means that throughout the course of this stream, we'll be just pulling up the super chats and the various love that has been thrown to us from both Twitch and YouTube. And we will be taking each one of those comments in turn and discussing them. Even if they're not necessarily tied to our topic of choice, but if they're not, you might find us saying we'll pick that one up on Discord later or in another stream. Other than that, I don't have a great deal to say other than you should buy Dark Deeds, the lovely game from Rookery Publications, which has just been shipped out to everybody. Look!
Dark Deeds! I can do it now! I've grown in power, yes.
Yeah, we've been playing that game like mad this last while, and I think it works particularly well given that the primary setting in that is a big port city, which is plagued by all manner of horror. But that's not really what the topic of today is. The topic of today is the Vampire Coast. Anything you'd like to open with before I dive into a crazy intro, Mr. Sotek?
Just a reminder for those who are watching that we are talking more about the place of the Vampire Coast as opposed to the faction. So, we're not going to talk about, Count Noctilus or Arnes Assault Spite or Celestial Deerfin. We're not going to talk about any of them because they have nothing to do with the Vampire Coast. Well, I say that. They might come up, but they probably won't, but they might.
And
but
that's
I'm not
good
planning
because
for it.
I get the Vampire Coast characters mixed up all the time, so I'm super pleased about that part. We're dealing with the actual coast itself. So if we're ready for my little intro, let's dive in where I began with the Vampire Coast. And for me, it was all the way back. Let's wind it back in time, as I am prone to do, and works relatively well for the good old timeless undead, to the undead army list. The very first one, the one that gave us Nagash, the one that gave us pretty much everything that we we understand as vampires and undead and ghouls and all the rest of it for Warhammer 4th edition. This was all the way back in the heady years when mists of time part and give us 1994. Now, in 1994, we're talking approximately, let's see, I was working for Games Workshop and had just started with Games Workshop. So that means we're talking the early part of 1994. And the Undead Army list dropped. And it was filled with fascinating details. In particular, it discussed for pretty much the first time, very, very briefly, the formation of the Vampire Coast. Now, for any of you out there that are aware, the Vampire Coast is attached on the edge of Lustria over to the far east. Now, if you don't know your Warhammer world very well, let me just give a quick description as to where that is. Imagine the real world, go down to South America, go out to the pointiest bit that sits out on the eastern coast, and then just go up a bit, and that is pretty much where Warhammer's version of the Vampire Coast is placed, but in the Warhammer world instead of the real world. So it's over in South America, Lustria, over to the far east, just above the pointy bits up there. So it's almost in the middle, but it's up a little bit. You could almost say the northeast if you wish, but it's far more the east of Lustria. And the Vampire Coast was given its first ever depiction, and it was tiny. It was nothing more than a date where a certain Luthor Harkin, a vampire lord, had set up his own little vampire place called the Vampire Coast of Lustria. And we got almost nothing else. Now, I remember this time because I'd seen world maps multiple times. The Vampire Coast had been mentioned, and it was the first time that we got ourselves any real detail for it. But the details were slight, and we weren't going to get anything more for it for a good number of years. So for those of us who were always looking for new lore to mine for our own games, very little came until approximately 1997. And this is a big date for someone who, for example, might go by the name of Loremaster of Sotek, because this is the date when the Lizardman army list arrived. This was the date when Warhammer did something that it hadn't done for a long time. It added something new. Now, the Lizardmen weren't actually that new. They were based on the old Slan that had come for the previous edition and 3rd edition. And the Slan were a Lizardman race, effectively. Frog race would be better. And this frog race were the old ones that had devolved. This obviously changed significantly with time. And in there, we get our first description of the Vampire Coast. And it's pretty long. We get ourselves about a paragraph and a half worth of detail about the Vampire Coast, the horrors that can be found there, and what happened when Luthor Harkin in his lovely coffin got dropped off and then, let's say, became somewhat of a maniacal king, deciding that he was going to rule this entire area and take hold of various artifacts of the old ones that were held by the Lizardmen. That, for me, was super cool, because for the first time, we had ourselves an idea of both what the Vampire Coast might be like and also what it might be like for the battles and the fights that go on there, which at the time, again, working for Games Workshop, immediately became campaign fodder. And apparently we weren't the only one thinking this. As we moved into the early 2000s, Games Workshop released a book called Lustria. Well, The Conquest of Lustria, if you want to go into the whole detail of it, but it's Lustria. And it was all the way back when Lustria was conquested by people who were rather colonial over in the old world. And it detailed nothing. Really? There was really nothing in there. But White Dwarf came to fill in the gap. Now, the Vampire Coast had been detailed through pretty much
I have this one.
There you go. Is that White
I
Dwarf?
this one, yeah.
Is that 306 that you've got? Or is that,
yeah, 305. Close.
305. So White Dwarf 305 is the one where they do the actual, hey, you know that Lustria thing? You can also do Vampire Coast. And they go into a good bit of extra detail in here, and it's super, super fun. We're going to be discussing that as we go. Now, for me, who was sitting there at this point, so we're now talking 2005, I was at this point writing for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and the urge to immediately do something Vampire Coast related was super, super high. Fortunately, I wasn't the one making the choices for the books back then. I was merely getting employed, so whatever they asked me to write about, I did. So I only did it for my own little campaigns, and I ran a little vampire thing for my own games because I can't help myself. Whenever I read something new, I immediately go, woohoo, let's do it. You didn't get necessarily a great deal of extra detail concerning them, but there was some fun quotes, some fun extra events, and there was also the good old pirate zombies. And you can't go wrong with a pirate zombie. And then we have yet again somewhat of a yawning gap. And the yawning gap spills out with a little bit of detail added for each Lizardman army list, and it's typically nothing more than, hey, that date that we've mentioned every single time about when it became the Vampire Coast still happened then. Luthor's still there. He's still doing his stuff. And, you know, occasionally he goes to war with one of the local places. Let's move on from this. Really, the next big, and if I'm going to say the truly big expansion, came from Total War. When Total War came along and eventually dived down into the Vampire Coast, they took what was a relatively lightly detailed place that had been mentioned here or there in an army list, inside a book, inside the Conquests of Lustria little expansion, which was really nothing more than the White Dwarf articles, all put together, took all of that and turned it into an entire faction. And that is where the Vampire Coast gets the vast majority of what many people recognize as the Vampire Coast details. And it became a pretty big faction. Characters who were either irrelevant or who had never existed before suddenly sprung into life. And as they sprung into life, people were playing with this faction for the first time and significantly, let's just say, giving it extra depth and extra power, because where beforehand they'd been nothing, they were now a core faction that people were playing with, who were on equal footing with the other undead factions, with the orcs, with the dark elves, with anything else. They were just as important. And that meant that as later books came out, they were always mentioned on the side until eventually Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 came along. That's the game that I kicked off all the way back in 1990. I'm going to guess 9. I can't remember when it was. And eventually, I planned a Lustria book, set the whole thing up to go. Then I resigned, and other hands came along, and they filled out the details afterwards. And that's where we get the last of our core detail. But not quite, because I do have one other thing to mention in terms of the overall timeline. Get to that right at the end, where we get our last of our core details of what is in the good old Vampire Coast, of which they took it in several new directions with a whole host of extra details regarding what could be found there. But there is one last thing to say. It's that thing that we often ignore in our streams, and I do mean we often ignore it, because it is prone to make the Loremaster of Sotek and I rant. Rant, rave, rave, rant.
What?
Rant and rave.
And shining beacons of positivity and making things work?
Possibly scream. And that's the end times. And the end times uses Luthor Harkin in particular. Now, it doesn't add a great deal of depth to our core topic today, which is the Vampire Coast. In fact, in many respects, it adds almost nothing other than taking Luthor Harkin and adding quite a bit of extra detail to his character. Add some extra details here and there. But for the core of what we're doing today, not much. But Luthor Harkin does become a core component of, let's say, the undead faction as a whole come the end times. So if you don't have those books and you're interested in learning more about the vampires of the Vampire Coast, as much as I am really loath to say here we go, I'm gonna bite my tongue. You should go check the end times.
So I actually want to butt in on this, of that the end times gave us one really important thing for this, and that's really it, which is that it gave us new custom unique artwork for Luthor Harkin, which was huge for the Total War timeline. They went, oh, that's what Luthor Harkin looks like, and gave us everyone's favorite Grand Arch Commodore. But that's pretty much it. That's
pretty much it. It doesn't really, for our stream today, which is largely the joy of the fetid Vampire Coast itself, it doesn't really do anything. But it is worth, if you're looking for extra detail about Luthor Harkin himself, worth diving into that. You get a strong idea of what his personality is come the end times. A personality that is largely picked up by the Fantasy Roleplay 4 version, where you can go check that out over in the Lustria book. So my long story with the Vampire Coast is actually not that long, and by that I mean it starts off early, back in 1994 for me at least, and it makes its way through time, but the vast majority of what was offered by Games Workshop was exceedingly light on details. They didn't provide us with much beyond, it's a Fetid Coast, there's vampires there. Luthor Harkin, he's a bit of a megalomaniac. Oh, by the way, there's some siren things, possibly. There's some ghost ships. And almost all of the details that we receive from the place are either penned by him or are picked up by the high elves who pass by the area, see a bunch of ghost ships and go, yeah, fuck this for a game of soldiers, and leave. So most of our details concerning the Vampire Coast are deeply suspect. And that's a good thing, because it means that when we're coming along and we're trying to rationalize it, when we eventually arrive at what appears to be a contradiction, there's probably going to be a contradiction or two.
Just a few.
Just a few. When we arrive at a contradiction, we're in a position where we can say, that's cool. It's not only cool, it makes sense, because most of the information that's come out of the Vampire Coast is incredibly unreliable, which allows us to then say, I look forward to going through this one, because the Vampire Coast is a super fun place, but at the same point, a super uncertain place, meaning that we can sort of say it says this, and now also says this, and then the roleplay book says this. Which way would you like to go with your version?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really fun things to get into with this, but before we get up and running, we're going to run through all of our Super Chat stuff real quick, and I'm going to start with the two that came in before last stream got moved. So Bohemian Snacksity asked, thank you for the $5 or £5, sorry, Super Chat. Just want to say you are cool. Oh, well, thank you. Meet and greet at some point. Would love to get my Dark Deeds signed and, of course, buy you a beer. Sotek a soda, of course. So I'm assuming because it was pounds that that is a British comment towards Andy. Also, me signing Dark Deeds would make no sense, but him signing Dark Deeds would make a lot of sense.
So yeah, if you're in the UK, I occasionally attend shows, as does Andy Chambers sometimes, one of the designers. Mark Gibbons, however, another one of the designers, he tends to only attend shows in the US and then only infrequently, when he's got something to attend for. But yeah, sure, if you ever find us at a con, do pop along, and I'd be more than happy to sign. Best way to find out what cons we're going to is to go over to the Rookery Publications Discord. Over there, whenever we attend a con, we tend to put up a quick message, assuming that we remember to do so.
Yeah, and check cons in the Edinburgh area for them being mentioned, because they show up to things.
Yeah.
Alfred also thank you for the Japanese yen. Do we know when dwarfs mastered black powder? Not really. Games Workshop has left that very, very vague. In fact, I'll actually say, as far as any faction discovering and inventing black powder is left incredibly nebulous. They never pin that down.
Yeah, it's one of those subjects that, depending upon the writer, you get a completely different version. The roleplay game goes, oh, it was discovered relatively late, and it came from here and here, and this is a date. And then the battle game goes, actually, no. And we had black powder all the way back here. I'd take, for example, the Lustria book. They had black powder in the Lustria book, and not with the dwarves. They had that with the Empire, and Estalia, and Tilia. And they had black powder, and that's all the way back in the 1400s, which means that they've been sitting pretty much technologically stymied for about 1,000 years with the same technology. And this also messes up with the dates in the fantasy roleplay game massively. So to cut a long story short in this one, the date is set by each writer, and they have contradicted again and again and again, and it gets particularly annoying when you read a little section that says something like this: and the ancestor gods knew everything about everything and passed it to the dwarves, including all the tech stuff. And all the later tech stuff the dwarves have in the Golden Age is rediscoveries of what came before. Wait, what? Oh, god damn it. So when did they first have it? Have they had it at the beginning? Did they discover it multiple times after? Each writer likes to take their own direction, so sadly, it's obscure.
Yeah, there's a whole thing of some writers will very much say, oh, well, yeah, dwarves had black powder during the War of Vengeance. And other writers will say, no, they didn't. No, they didn't. And so it's like, if they have, then that's before Sigmar by quite a distance. Yeah. I'll put it this way. The most amusing thing that I've seen in regards to black powder is that with Cathay now introduced and them having their own version of Black Powder, Games Workshop is being kind of confronted with this unfortunate question of, well, where did it come from? Like, who had it first? And I think GW's current answer is something along the lines of, the dwarfs say they had it first, but Cathay says, "Nuh-uh, we did," and that's all we're gonna say on that.
Yeah,
like, okay.
As is often the case with the battle games lore creep, it's very likely that the newer factions, as they are pinned down in place and the depth of their history is properly explored, they will push it back, largely because whenever they try to tell stories with the dwarves, they like to have them firing guns. And whilst individual authors might not do that because they think, oh, it definitely wouldn't have had it back then, Games Workshop as a whole will want to have their dwarves with guns. So whenever they are dealing with very early versions of the dwarves, you're going to find that that's eventually going to be the case no matter what individual writers prefer. So I would gently suggest that regardless of what lore you might find, that in some fashion or another, the dwarves have always had it sitting around somehow, and it has been lost and rediscovered potentially from different holds, allowing you to have the different it's been discovered stories and allowing each one of them to make sense when you unearth and unmine them in the background.
Yeah, I agree with Andy. I would not be shocked if the old world actually ends up pinning down some dates that, of course, will be contradicted at some point later in the future.
Yep, agreed completely.
By the way, Yeti, thank you for the gift sub, and Super Ego, thank you for the wah. Ricky Chapman, pray to Manon for you be going to the Vampire Coast. Yeah, big time. The Vampire Coast, one of the really fun things about it that isn't super crazy relevant to what we'll be getting into, but is worth mentioning, is that it is a place of legend in the old world. It is a place that is spooky. That, like, if you have a bunch of sailors telling ghost stories, the Vampire Coast will likely come up. If someone, especially with the way that a lot of sailors like to embellish and exaggerate, even if they've probably been nowhere near the old world or the new world, like they've only just sailed around to Australia or whatever, they'd be like, oh yeah, I got real close to the Vampire Coast. I can tell you the terrible things I saw there. Whereas the ones who've actually been over there probably are wiser to just not talk about the things they witnessed there because it's bad.
I agree completely. The Vampire Coast has picked up almost this legendary name in the same way that in the real world, the various pirate Caribbean locations similarly picked up
the Bermuda Triangle
or the Barbary Coast or the Bermuda Triangle. All of these places have picked up almost legendary status as to what they were and what they represented for sailors on the high seas, meaning that although the Vampire Coast is extremely distant from the old world, it is somewhere that is known by many a sailor purely by the various sea shanties that have been passed over, or alternatively by the various dark tales of the high seas and the terror that can be found there, particularly given that in later years the ships of the Vampire Coast begin to span out across the oceans, meaning that they will be encountered in a whole host of different places across not just the old world but the Warhammer world as a whole. So
Yep. Lord Sarthenius, stream to sneak in to listen at work. Yes, perfect. Yes, don't work, just listen. Sean Soltz, how does Storm of Chaos affect the Storm of Chaos? I think you mean a Storm of Magic. Storm of Chaos would be a little different. But what does Andy think of mysterious locations in the patch? So, in answer to the first thing, we'll actually talk about when something akin to a Storm of Magic hit the Vampire Coast. And the answer was, it was bad for everyone, not the vampires. Magic to vampires, pretty good juice. They could do a lot of cool stuff with it, and they do. To pretty devastating effect. And we'll talk about a year that lives in infamy, known as the Night of the Restless Dead, and what that did over at the Vampire Coast, because it did something. So we'll get into that a little later. But as far as I don't know if Andy has seen
I purposely avoided it. I was half tempted to go and do a stream about it at some point and just read through it and find out what's what, but I haven't done that either. But so I don't know yet. So it's in spoiler territory for me at the moment.
Well, maybe if you bribe him enough, he'll do it tomorrow or something. Fire Snake, thank you very much. The soup says doubloons for the coffers. What is the worst monster found in the area? Well, worst is a bit of a nebulous term. So more than likely, it's going to be what Total War players know as the undead Leviathan creature.
Which is hilarious.
In the original White Dwarf, the Leviathan is left deliberately vague what it is. Of that, a Leviathan, one of these undead Leviathans, it could be a giant crab monster, which is what they ran with for Total War Warhammer, that it's a huge Promethean type creature. Or it could be a sea dragon, or it could be some other kind of big sea serpent, or it could be a megalodon, or it could be a black Leviathan, or it could be any number of it's just a big, horrible undead sea monster, which, to be fair, is pretty scary. There's even some the roleplay game took a bit of an interesting angle when it came to Lustria and some of the big Griblies that can be found in the area, as they how do I put this very simply? They ran with a very strong suggestion that there is a culture that predates the Lizardmen, which is totally fine and great and awesome. And that elements of it still reside, especially around the eastern coast. And from my reading, it basically seems like they're leaning really heavily into the concept of the fishmen being very, very, very Lovecraftian, and that there's some kind of Lovecraftian things around the Vampire Coast, and especially over on the isle, the volcanic islands that are right over there with the City of the Dead. And that, because City of the Dead, they leaned very heavily into that being like, City of the Dead, like, the thing that Lovecraft calls Riele or whatever the hell, wherever Cthulhu hangs out. So it's a pseudo joke, pseudo serious thing. So you could argue that there is a horrifying fishman Lovecraftian god that is asleep somewhere in the Vampire Coast, which is what 4th edition roleplay runs with, and says that Luthor Harkin is trying to wake it up, which is just great. And to be fair, something he would probably do because he's fucking insane. But but for most people that come into that area, it's going to be big, horrible undead fish monsters.
Yep.
Whether it's a kraken or a sea dragon. Actually, especially if you go read the novel or the little book surrounding the Dreadfleet book, there were a number of sea creatures they introduced that are all undead, and they're horrible. Well, not all of them, but most of them are undead. My personal favorite is the leech worm, which the leech worm is it's a sea dragon's corpse that is kind of puppeted by a bunch of leeches that are like larger than a man. And so it's like this big colony of leeches that live on the corpses of sea creatures, and they make it move so that it wraps around vessels, and the leeches start dropping out of the ship and eating people, which is pretty fucking horrible. But makes her a great monster. Great monster.
That's actually the one I was going to reference. So all I've got to add to that is, if you want to look at the classic ones, the sea monsters, go check the old Man of War game. In particular, the expansion for Man of War, which added all the monsters. And they're the monsters that we know and love today, like your Leviathans and your black nasties from down below. So yeah, but beyond that, everything that was said there.
J-Station, my friends and I played some Dark Thieves this weekend. We had a blast. Excellent.
Delighted to hear that. Yeah, I was playing it just 2 days ago as well, and I had an absolute whale of a time. It was just proper silly, and I didn't win, so I'm rather sad.
Yeah, I'm hoping to play with my family this weekend. Which, by the way, a reminder that if you haven't picked it up, you need to, especially because there's not an infinite number of them. So
no, it's actually worth noting that our stocks are particularly low because an awful lot of the stock went out into the retail environment, but the actual stock that Modiphius is holding is pretty low, so I do recommend ordering soon.
Yep, so if you want it, get it before it's gone. Smiling Kira, I thought vampires cannot cross moving water. That's a great super chat. Let's talk about that for a second. So this, you have to keep in mind that this also draws from the stories of the likes of Dracula, where Dracula has a whole thing about he doesn't cross certain forms of moving water. There's a whole point in the book where it's about getting over a river to get away from him. And now in Warhammer Fantasy, one of the really fun things and also really scary things about vampires that me and Andy have talked about in the past is that they're inconsistent on purpose. Of that, when you encounter a vampire, there is no necessarily guaranteed method of dealing with them or what their weaknesses or strengths may be. Some vampires can't cross moving water. Others can do so with no problem. Some cannot enter your home without invitation. Others can. Some are very averse to the likes of Witchbane or Wolfbane. Others don't care. Most of them are deeply affected by the sun or religious iconography, particularly Sigmarite, but not all of them. So vampires be spooky because you never know what, you might be like, aha, I have this foolproof way to deal with you. And the vampire's like, yeah, no, not me.
Yeah, pretty much think of every single stereotype of a vampire, and Warhammer vampires have it somewhere, but they don't have it consistently. And this particularly includes the moving water thing. Now, typically the moving water issue isn't moving water per se, it's rivers. And it's not normally the sea. It's normally rivers. Dracula, for example, he was shipped across the ocean in a coffin, as rather famously, in fact, before he eventually landed in London. But equally had issues with crossing moving water. Moving water is generally rivers and similar, and there's a host of very old reasons for that. And the vampires in the Warhammer world are generally similar, and that is that those who can't cross moving water, it's not moving water, it's running water, it is rivers. And similar, you get across a river and they suddenly got problems, they're not going to be getting to you in the same way that some might be held back by salt or holy symbols or whatever else it might be. So the answer to your question is you're correct, but you're also completely wrong.
Welcome to Warhammer.
Welcome to Warhammer.
Quizzer Thomas, Vampire Coast characters tend to have pretty Britishy English/Welsh, etc. names, but there isn't really an Anglo-Britain equivalent in Warhammer. Where are these undead sailors coming from? So the answer is, of course, developers just having fun and not giving a damn. Realistically, in universe, you're right. They would not have super British names, although we do love them. And their names would be more either from where they're from, whether it's Astalia or Talea or the Empire, or Bretonia, or like there wouldn't be a lot
or actually the big one, and the one that it originally always was, Norska.
Yeah, Norska. There'd be a lot of like Icelandic, Norwegian,
loads of them. So you're absolutely correct in this one, and this is a classic example of British writers writing shit without giving a fuck. And they don't necessarily think about the broader background and exactly what they're creating. And sometimes that's to the benefit of Warhammer, because people come along later and go, well, I now need to justify this. They fill in some really cool lore gaps. But other times, they just don't. So in the case of what we have down with the Vampire Coast, we have an original vampire that was in a Norscan ship. So it was a big, long ship that he originally arrived in a coffin. And all of the Norse along with him were undead by the end of that particularly dread journey. And then, depending upon which version of the background you go with, a host of other ships were drawn in, most of which were actually Norse with most of the backgrounds, meaning that the vast majority of the original people should have Norse names, probably. But I will contradict one point. There is an Anglo-Britain equivalent in Warhammer. It's Albion. Albion just isn't particularly well detailed. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't get a host of Albion-sounding characters from that area. So there is many ways we could justify this post if we wish to do so. And there's many ways that we could make this work if we just sat down and went, let's have a good think. So what is your core point is 100% correct, but simultaneously I think it could be very easily pushed together.
Yeah, it's one of those things where in the current setting no one bothers to answer this, but it's not that difficult to come up with an answer if you really want to.
Yep, that.
Let's see here. Ford, Army Hearties. I'm so glad the first Lorebeards stream I get to catch live. Thanks, COVID-68 is on my faction from Total Warhammer 2. Well, sorry you have COVID. Hopefully it's very mild and you feel better soon. But we're glad you could join us.
Yeah, I hate COVID with a passion that is undying like the sun, which means eventually it'll die out one day, perhaps, but not in my lifetime. And I've caught it more times than I can shake a stick at, and it has laid me low, so I very much feel for you.
Yeah. Captain Magma, given what the Vampire Coast is, how often are conflicts between Clan Pestilence and what would drive them to conflict? So, Clan Pestilence is actually a ways, like the heart of Clan Pestilence. It's a good ways from the Vampire Coast. Down in Quetzal and Chakwa. And that's a good distance from northeastern Lustria down to southern central Lustria. That being said, would there be conflicts between them? Yes, absolutely. They're not well detailed because a lot of the time when you're dealing with the Vampire Coast, You're pretty much up against lizardmen, and that's basically it. That's what most if not all of their stories revolve around. And generally speaking, the Vampire Coast, which I'll get into when we after we get through all the super chats, the Vampire Coast struggles for a myriad of reasons to go very far inland. It's very, very hard for them. And the Skaven, by contrast, don't really like the ocean a lot of the time. There are some Skaven clans that are particularly good at it. The Lustrian clans are not those clans. They do not have much of a presence in the New World. Clan Pestilence prefers to be up to their gross pestilentiness in the depths of the jungle and deep underground caverns. The purifying salt of the sea is not really their bread and butter.
Yeah, I agree completely. The Vampire Coast is a relatively tight location when it comes to its inland battle formations, in that it deals with a bit where it is, and that's about it. It doesn't go in too far. Having said that, though, we do have a good 1,000+ years of history, and in that time, inevitably, there will have been many inroads into Lustria, some of which were successful, some of which weren't successful. In the same way that the oceans around that area are entirely dominated by them, particularly given that they are, at their heart, undead. And undead, as we know, are quite capable of carrying on a fight that everyone else just stops because of seasons, because of the difficulty of the environment, because of, and the big one here, disease. The greatest weapon that Clan Pestilence can bring to the table does not affect, in any great way at all, the undead, meaning that the Clan Pestilence, as it stands, do not fare as well against this particular foe as they would against others. So I think that they have almost certainly come to conflict multiple times, even though the Lustria book primarily focuses upon lizardmen versus the Clan Pestilence with a bunch of invaders, and it really doesn't touch the vampires. When we get our extra White Dwarf articles, and when we look at the world as a whole, almost certainly it's happened again and again and again. But in this one, I would say that Clan Pestilence doesn't fare as well as it normally could because of the nature of what vampires are. And we also get another little detail from this that I do think is worth popping out. When the vampires are attempting to make their inroads in, they have to summon in folk, basically, to become their next set of undead. Again, strongly implying that necromancy largely works on humans. There is a really fascinating setup for how the Vampire Coast works. And that setup is that the locals, the lizardmen, the Skaven, whatever else is there, just aren't good enough for their magic. They have to bring in external forces to get all the zombies and similar that they need. So it is worth noting that the force that they have is not necessarily that big to begin with, takes a long time to build up, makes its first few forays, and eventually becomes a force in the area. But that force in the area doesn't come into contact with them often.
Yeah, I will note that, in my opinion, and this is just because Lustria, frankly, doesn't get a lot of attention as much as it should, as you know, which we could say about tons of places in the Warhammer world.
Yeah, totally.
Anything outside of the Empire doesn't get enough attention. The idea that there isn't a fun storyline about some minor Skaven clans, especially with a more Eshin leaning, trying to manipulate Harkin and his madness, putting a really hilarious spin on it, of the Skaven finding him virtually impossible to manipulate because he's so unpredictable. That would be a really fun storyline that I think someone should explore, because in my opinion, that's probably how it would go down, of the Skaven attempting to manipulate him, which they're normally very, very good at, but his unpredictability would make him a nightmare for anyone to try and mess with.
Yeah, agreed.
Which we'll talk about. There are some stories about it. There's just no one has explored it from a Skaven angle, which is a shame because they really should.
Yeah, agreed.
Let's see. Mads, thank you very much for the
thanks, Mads.
For both of them. Appreciate that. Hey, Sotek, I asked Andy this last Saturday, but I wanted your take too. Did an Aryan the Defender ever kill any elves? Sorry, this is off topic. Actually, I watched that stream. And I was like, oh, I wonder what Andy's gonna say. I generally agree with what Andy said, of that there's nothing in the current lore that suggests he would have. However, I think there is a potential unexplored tragedy that would be really good. Yeah. The thing that really came to my mind is, if you wanted to delve really well into what was the straw that broke the camel's back that caused Kalidor Dragon Tamer and all of his allies to leave an Aryan's court, the killing of another elf by an Aryan, not necessarily him personally, but like through his politics or whatever, or it could have been him himself personally with the Widowmaker, that would be pretty dramatic and would be like, oh, that's where Kalidor says, no, this is, I can't do this anymore.
But it would have made, I think, Anarian a character that would have been not Anarian the Defender. He would have been Anarian the Wicked. He'd have been Anarian the Terrible. Yeah. He would have been Anarian that fell, and whilst he was a figure of extraordinary heroism who managed to hold off the chaos tide, he would nevertheless have been one who was marked down in history forever as a kin killer. And he wasn't. He's not an Aryan kinslayer. He's not basically Elric or Melnibone. And if you go back to the Michael Moorcock inspiration for many of the characters here, he's not that character. He doesn't use Stormbringer to kill his own kin. He's not Elric kinslayer. He is very much an Aryan the Defender and a heroic entity. And Games Workshop tends to make their heroes mightily heroic even when they're the darkest ones. Yeah, I think in this case it's probably unlikely.
I think what you would have seen, actually, when I think back to a short story about an Aryan that has his perspective, is I think you would have had, while an Aryan has the Widowmaker, he certainly has impulses, and there is a desire that is noticed by others, but he never does it, which is a showcase of his heroism, to resist the urge of the Widowmaker, because the Widowmaker don't give a shit. Cain would be all about, like, kill everybody.
In many respects, though, if you actually consider what the effect of that blade is to all the elves around them, it basically turns them all into killmongers. So there's no need to kill the elves. They're on your side. They're the ones who are effectively in tune with your blade. Killing someone with Widowmaker in that regard is a little bit like attacking one of your own weapons, and Widowmaker's all about the killing of the enemies of Cain. Yeah, I think it's just not that likely.
Yeah, I don't think he ever would have killed anyone with it. I really don't. Because it adds a wrinkle to the story you don't need. But I would not at all be upset if there is a moment where he almost does, but he resists for some reason, of someone denying him, of someone telling him no, and him having to, have that moment of control where you see his nobler side wrestling with a different side.
Particularly because he's also absolutely possessed by the power of a god, which is easy to forget. It's not just Widowmaker that's within him. It's Azurin, the judge, the divine creator of heaven. This is the god of all gods. And if anyone's going to make a good judgment, it's that god. And their good judgment was apparently to draw Widowmaker. Ooh, it's a thing.
Yeah. Jen, I ran a one-shot back in 2002 that chose to help Harkin instead of the Lizardman and ended up being as a villainous game. And that works great.
Fun. Love that one, Jen.
Yeah, I think if you're running, take this with a grain of salt, but I think if you're running Lustria well for a group of human PCs, it can be very, very easy. And I think you should aspire to make them... The Lizardmen are a very cold... hard to understand race of reptilian creatures that think very different than any humans do, and they think very long term, which can make them very dangerous and very nasty. And the idea that some humans, well-intending humans, would end up siding with a very, shall we say, eccentric vampire lord over the very cold alien race that is native to Lustria, I don't think is that ridiculous. I don't even think it would necessarily be a villainous game unless you're looking at it from a very zoomed out perspective. A story I actually really, really enjoy, which is relevant to the Vampire Coast for reasons we'll talk about in a little while, is the second Thanquol book, which is called Temple of the Serpent. And that book has a human cast that gets caught up in the Skaven shenanigans. And one of the things about the book that's really fun is showing how difficult it is for the humans to figure out if the Lizardmen are the evil thing or if the Skaven are the evil thing. Or if they're just both super evil, but in different ways. And it's really fun because as a reader, if you like the Lizardmen, you're reading that book going, no, obviously the Lizardmen are the good guys. But when you see everything the Lizardmen do to them, not because the Lizardmen are evil, but just because of a cold set of logical decisions from a Lizardman perspective, you understand why the humans don't like them very much. They're pretty horrible.
I agree completely. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, if you're playing the role-playing game, works at its best when it's dealing with the shades of grey or the other colours that might sit at the table rather than the black and white of the core battle setting, where bad guys are bad guys, good guys are good guys, and they are the twain shall meet. But where Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay really shines is in that grey, grubby space in the middle where you've got to make uncomfortable allies. You've got to potentially go to war with people who are ostensibly good guys purely because they have been manipulated or twisted or just don't agree with you. And I think that that is where it shines. Now, obviously, a one-shot's a one-shot, so you can just go evil, great, positive, negative, whatever you want. But for overall campaigns, I agree completely that there is a wealth of opportunities inside somewhere like the Vampire Coast for creating something that you wouldn't normally expect at your games master table. And that's something that we generally use over on the LAWhammer side if you don't watch the LAWhammer actual plays, where there's so much shades of grey that no one can even see through the mist anymore.
Oh, yeah. LAWhammer is a fucking mess, morally.
Of heretics.
Finchmeister, White Dwarf 306 also gets the first sighting of a Pleiadon. I want to say the book, the White Dwarf, comes out like right after the Lustria book did.
It came out about a year after, or a few months after,
so
anyway.
The Lustria book is the first time that art was done.
Yeah, so that's 2004. Yeah.
Yeah. But,
and then White Dwarf 306, as I recall, is 2005. Again, though, running off my memery here.
I believe that's correct, because I think they referenced
right.
I think they referenced the... Yes, you're right. June 2005. And he still got it. Yeah, so the
Lustria... uphill all night, but that made no difference to my memory today. I love it.
But yeah, the Pleiadon, the art they made, all of the art we got in the Lustria book is gorgeous. Honestly, a lot of people... myself in particular think 6th edition was like the peak of a lot of Warhammer art, of that black and white, really grim fantasy art.
The Kapinskis
still
in
really
particular.
Fun. And yes, that book actually features a really famous piece of the Pleiadon fighting a bunch of Vampire Coast zombies, which is super cool. Christopher Clayton, last week I had a conversation with my petroleum engineer father about how viable it might be for Norse dwarves to have access to natural gas. That would not shock me in the slightest.
Very viable, I think. Unless, of course, your petroleum engineer father says, yeah, no, that's definitely not happening. I think that that's not just viable, it's very likely. One of the great joys of the dwarves is their core component of going down, getting access to minerals and, let's say, the bounty of the earth in a way that other species don't. And if you've got yourself an obvious set of peoples who could access not just the natural gas but also the oils that are potentially up there, it should be done. Take a look at the dwarf navy. It is using an enormous quantity of, effectively, oil to make itself work, and that means that you need to then figure out where that's coming from, and I think this is one of the natural answers for it.
Yeah, sometimes you get writers with the dwarfs that are like allergic to the dwarfs using anything more complicated than black powder and steam. And then they use those things in like sci-fi levels of ways. When it's like, no, it'd be a lot more logical that they would be utilizing other resources like we did back in our ancient past of natural gas and oil and all these other types of resources.
Mm-hmm.
Isaac, what percentage of the Vampire Coast faction Total War is actual lore? What percentage is creative liberties to put together a playable faction? So most of the faction is ripped straight from White Dwarf 306 or 305, whatever it is. Like just directly ripped out of it. They just kind of like finalize some of the details. But the only things that are not from that are from the Monstrous Arcanum to kind of reinforce parts of the list. Like the Mournguls originally had absolutely nothing to do with the Vampire Coast.
Yeah.
And if you read their lore, they really shouldn't have anything to do with Vampire Coast because they're a mountain winter spirit type creature, not a ocean thing. That being said, Total War, hilariously enough, actually addresses this and actually explains that the Mournguls are in the Vampire Coast because there are vampires within the Vampire Coast who have learned how to essentially manufacture them, which is horrifying if you know how they're made. Of that, they're essentially what do you call them? The Wendigo spirits, but like the actual story behind a Wendigo spirit, not like the antlered deer creature that pop culture has turned them into. So technically they could be manufactured. It would just require you to make somewhere freakishly cold and basically starve people and force them to do cannibalism, which if you have a bunch of death wizards hanging out, it's not that hard of a situation to conjure up. They can do that.
So my answer in this one is a surprisingly small percentage is new material. The vast majority of it is just a copy-paste job. What's new is all of the interconnecting tissue. In that, the overall arc of it is entirely lifted, dropped, and just fleshed out, and it's all that extra flesh that makes the faction so much fun, because the vast majority of what is the Vampire Coast faction is actually original. It doesn't look it because it is just a copy-paste job, but because there was so little actual depth for the Vampire Coast up to that point, including its basic troops, they were basically hardly detailed anywhere. Actually seeing them all concepted out and turn into a complete faction was, for me on the outside, an absolute joy. I've also got one small thing I want to bring up there from, is that the correct one? From Undead and Alive. And I'm not going to answer your question specifically. I'm just going to say, if anyone's got any questions about getting hold of Dark Deeds, your best bet is to pop over to the Discord for the Rookery. So that's Rookery Publications Discord. There's a link to that over in LAWhammer, or over, just go Rookery Publications.
And I will pop a link to that in the description of this video.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, I will do that.
Go check that out and ask there. But loosely, if you want to order it, there's two hubs, the US and the UK, and just go to the closest hub. So in your case, go order it from the UK hub. So that's modifius.uk. I presume that's the number. And then go pop in there.
Thank you for that, Isaac. But yeah, for the most part, very little that they did. Actually, one other thing I want to say is that really fucking clever thing that CA did was the Necrofex Colossus, which is the big ship creature. Hilariously, that originally had nothing to do with the Vampire Coast, and CA looked at that and went, "That's obviously a Vampire Coast monster," and everyone went, "Oh yeah, you're right."
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
So yeah. Biofoot, to address the elephant in the room, what relationship do the fishermen have with the location of the Vampire Coast? Do they summer there? So, talked about this a little bit earlier. The 4th edition roleplay actually ties them very closely together. Would there be a relationship there? Probably, honestly. Once again, not something a writer ever really ran with, but if you ever wanted to run with the idea of like the Vampire Coast attempting to take over more of the coastline of Lestria and heading further south and reaching Chup Yodel, the Vampire Coast are one of the very few factions that could war with the fishmen on very equal terms, and talk to them. And you could run with the idea of, like, if you go check out like the Lovecraftian story about the Road to Innsmouth, of the idea of like, oh, the fishermen come and make a pact with people, someone on land in exchange for like certain materials. They exchange things back and forth. If anyone was going to have a surprisingly good relationship with the fishermen, it would probably be the Vampire Coast.
Yeah, so I'm quite happy to say that as we discussed in our Fisherman stream, which I do recommend you go watch, because we dived deep into this. It was loads of fun. There's firstly probably multiple factions of fishmen. There's probably more than one group. So I think it's much like most of the factions in Warhammer, likely that we would have both allies and enemies, and that the Vampire Coast in particular would be at war with and working with some of those groups. They would be fully aware of them, and they would be coming up from the depths to take those ships down, and equally they would be marching across the bottom of the seas, because they're undead and they can do so, to go to war with the fishmen in their own environment. This is one of the rare factions, so that if there was ever a high seas Warhammer game with fishmen and various other factions, the Vampire Coast would be absolutely central to that. And this is one of the great unspoken stories of the Warhammer world, in the same way that the fishmen as a whole are one of the great unspoken stories of the Warhammer world, in that they're always there on the periphery, but they're never really used with any great depth. And in this case, definitely.
Let's see. Watchdog, ever thought of running a roleplay session around the Vampire Coast or even Dreadfleet? I certainly have, especially with the Lestria book. It actually gives some really fun details you can use for the Vampire Coast. Dreadfleet would be bonkers, but you could do it. Absolutely. Like the idea of being like a random group of hardcore mariners that are caught up in the events of Dreadfleet. So you're like dealing with the captains and you're picking sides, and you also have like Count Noctilus attempting to sway you to his side through various things, and you get to like explore all the aspects. You could literally make an entire campaign, like year-plus long campaign, about just surviving the events of the Dreadfleet campaign, which could be pretty fun.
If you played Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd edition, there was a Dreadfleet expansion for that. It was back at the time when the game was very much dictated by whatever the current product of the day was. So in that particular case, Dreadfleet had just come out. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3 was a thing, and they went to the licensee, in this case FFG Games, and said, we want a Dreadfleet expansion, to which they went, alrighty, let's see if we can somehow fit this in. It's the craziest expansion. It has nothing to do with the main game at all, but it was very much picked up as part of the possibilities that you have on your role-playing sessions. And it's one of the things that I think Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay often misses, and I do mean often, and that's that because it's so focused on the old world, they forget that it's a Warhammer game, and that it's a game that can and should expand across the Warhammer world and take in lots of different types of role-playing. You should be able to play different factions that are normally considered to be bad guys, because it is all about shades of grey, but it's a game that focuses so heavily on the Empire in particular that we very rarely get to see this sort of thing. Nevertheless, it should be done.
Yeah. Also, Only Fly P, if you want to include your question, because I am reading both the chats. So
yeah, me too, and I couldn't see that one on the bits question earlier.
Yeah, but oh no, I do see your question. I'll get around to it in just a minute.
Thank you very much.
Hammond, Andy, what's your favorite vampire? Mine is Dick Halfmast. That is a popular one.
Dick Halfmast. I'm just going to leave it there.
Just leave it there.
Leave it there.
Sean Schultz, are the fishermen a part of the Vampire Coast? Debatably.
I think we've covered that to a degree, and we think that it's far more likely that it would be both an antagonistic and potentially allied force, both around and close to them, rather than necessarily being a part of it. Because vampires, this vampire in particular, is particularly megalomaniacal and very much likes to hold the terrain that he has in his very much corpse-like grasp.
Yep. Isty and Lion, any other factions you think would be attempting to manipulate Harkin? I already put a Lamian in his court. There's always Lamians, always. And funny enough, a Lamian dealing with Harkin would be a particularly amusing because there are ways to deal with him, but it does require you to be very, very quick-witted and snappy about dealing with his mood swings, essentially. Or his personality changes, which a Lamian would be pretty ideal for. But of course, there are other members of his court that are going to be trying to do other things. And so that being said, Lamians, absolutely. I do think, like we talked about, Skaven would also make a lot of sense. Canonically, the Dark Elves have a relationship with Luthor Harkin. Their relationship is strained, but they do have a relationship. And furthermore, there are actually mentions that Harkin has met with other pirate lords. He's even met with high elves, and even just regular merchants that because he's been in a particular mood, he just talks to them and lets them go instead of killing them. He's not always just on the warpath. He has other moods that take him sometimes. And sometimes he's in a very clear-headed mood, and he decides that they would be better off used for something else. So, yes, is what I would say.
Yeah, me too. Are any factions you think would be attempting to manipulate Harkon? Yes, particularly and strongly factions that lie within his own court. He has effectively a court that he leads as king. That court would be attempting to manipulate him in multiple directions. But external to that, the Lamians are the obvious first choice, and the obvious second choice are the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves have strained relations, but they have relations, and they've allied with the Vampire Coast on more than one occasion in the past, meaning that they don't just have diplomatic connection, they likely have a small group that work possibly even in and around the Vampire Coast, and that's super fun because that starts adding extra opportunities for roleplay and similar. And the last one of the third most obvious are pirates themselves, although the fear that many a pirate would have of the undead pirate I think would be quite high.
Yeah, but don't underestimate the pirates and the Norskins especially. Don't underestimate the pirates of Lustria. Pirates that hang out around Lustria are the nastiest of pirates oftentimes, because that is a hard life. So I would not underestimate them trying to deal with Harkin. Bart Key, hi Andy and Sotek. 2 questions. How does Luthor raise the dead being disconnected from the winds? Plus, are there any settlements in the Vampire Coast? So, great question. That is actually a big thing that we're going to talk about today, is how Luthor Harkin works, to be frank. So the in-universe answer is that prior to his sanity breaking, Luthor Harkin was exceptionally gifted at magic. Like, he is a very powerful sorcerer as far as vampires go, which is saying a lot because vampires are already pretty powerful sorcerers, but Luthor Harkin was up there. And he was very good at using a series of complex rituals to basically turn the vampire coast into a bit of a churning machine that was good at not only luring in sailors, but resurrecting their corpses. And there's even a really cheeky discussion in the White Dwarf article about him, about how he even came up with this ritual. Remember, think about what I'm about to say to let you know how fucking insanely strong he was. Luthor Harkin came up with a ritual almost 2,000 years ago that allowed his zombies to have perfect accuracy. According to the lore, the zombies of the Vampire Coast, because of Luthor's ritual, not only maintained the ability to use black powder weapons, but their accuracy, in spite of being zombies, is actually perfect. The only reason they miss isn't because they missed, it's because the black powder didn't catch, because it's wet the vast majority of the time. So they had a special rule where if they rolled a 6, they always hit, no matter what, no matter how bad their ballistic skill is, because it's magically reinforced. But if they roll a 1, their powder literally explodes and kills them because they're basically Skaven. So Harkin basically was just the GOAT when it came to certain forms of necromancy. And he laid down a lot of really powerful things before his brain got scrambled eggs. But even after his brain gets scrambled egg, Harkin basically is the best way to describe it is that he's kind of a black hole for magic. Like, he just sucks it up and it goes somewhere. And because of that, he's constantly drawing the winds of magic to him. Well, depending on which author you look at, there are some authors that say he repels it. Others say that he absorbs it. But regardless, where he goes, the dead get up. And it's regardless of which version they go with, whether it's he's absorbing magic or repelling magic, they specifically note that even though Luthor Harkin cannot control the winds of magic, nor can he see the winds of magic, he can still control the dead. There's still some piece of him that's maintained that ability somehow.
Yeah, he's a much more material entity. It fits quite well with the whole concept of the vampire knight as well. There are multiple examples of his extraordinary ability, as Sotek has already described. And what he becomes afterwards, it matches up with lore that you find in many of the darker corners of Warhammer lore. And by that I mean that wherever magic gathers in large quantities, it has the potential of animating the dead. So basically it takes bones and distant flesh and it binds it together and brings it up, which is why when there's great storms of magic, the undead sometimes stir, and it doesn't need a spell to make them stir. And this is because of the mixture of the winds of magic and often forming into Dar, causing undead to rise in various points. And sometimes they will come back with their memories, sometimes they will come back basically as automatons or basically constructs, for want of a better description. And what's happening down in the Vampire Coast is very much related to that kind of lore. It has adapted the existing magic does this sort of thing, and then placed it down there with magic does this sort of thing here because of stuff that he has done. And then he, as a vampire, has the natural capability to control undead entities as well, without necessarily drawing upon the winds of magic to do that, because he is basically a vampire. And that's part of their raison d'etre, right back to Nagash himself, who went, vampires, you are now the generals of the undead. It's part of their process. It's what they're supposed to be. They are in many respects the conduit of Nagash. He gives the will to the vampire uses that to control the undead. That's super simplistic, by the way. That's not what it's actually like. That's in Nagash's own head when he was building his original model of how it was all going to work, and then the vampires went and pissed it all off and betrayed him, and it all went wrong.
From Nagash's eyes.
Yeah, that's from Nagash's perspective. But nevertheless, vampires do have this ability to control undead around them without needing spells to say, you undead, you're mine now. It's much more, right, you go that way, and they do. So yeah, there are many ways that Luthor does does everything that you've suggested there, and it all matches the lore. This isn't Luthor is something unique. This is Luthor using the existing mechanics of the Warhammer world and adapting them to the location that he's in.
Yeah, and a quick other note is that when Luthor Harkin arrives, which we'll talk more about this once we get through Super Chats, in the Vampire Coast, that part of the coastline was naturally a magnet to death magic. There's a reason that before it was called the Vampire Coast, it was called just the Blood Marshes. And the area north of that is called the
I forget off the top of my head.
The Pox Marsh. So like it already wasn't a great place. It had issues, and he took advantage of those issues. And a lot of that death magic became saturated and turned into dark magic. Which, like Andy said, it doesn't actually take a lot to get a corpse to start shambling around, especially when you're dealing with just zombies. Not that hard, pretty easy. But
there's a reason that most of the dark magic spells and necromancy that raise the dead, they're actually quite simple spells. And there's a reason
necromancy go off on like a 5 or a 6.
Yeah, necromancy is so tempting to many wizards, and that's because it's easy access to power, because dark magic in general is easy access to power. It's also deeply corrupting, and will turn you potentially into some sort of horror show. So yeah, with the good comes the bad.
Yeah, gun for bullets. I was wondering, does the Vampire Coast not have enough named characters? Is that why they use Arnis Assault by Until War?
Yeah.
The only named character is literally Luthor Harkin. And then, depending on which author you ask, his first mate, who in the end times was Captain Drekla, who was another vampire, but in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is Black Jenkins, who is a ghoul who is 1,700 years old. So it just depends on which author you ask. In the original White Dwarf, they don't even name his first mate. But yeah, it's just him. So CA went, what if we just combined it with the very obvious Dreadfleet, which has an entire bad guy faction of undead? Because Count Noctilus, Captain Van Geist, and Scretch Half-Dead are all, and the Tomb King character actually, are all undead characters. The only non-undead person on the Dreadfleet is the Chaos Dwarf, who's not a normal Chaos Dwarf. He is a dwarf that fell to chaos, not a Chaos Dwarf from Zarnagrind. But yeah, so yes, that is why they use the likes of Arnis Assault Spite.
Yep.
Armand, where do they get their black powder? Is it traded, raided, stolen, or made by them? And is it magical and works when wet? So this is a hilarious question, because it's one of those ones where if you look at it, you go, uh-oh. And the setting refuses to answer this.
Blank.
Yeah, all they say is they have it, which means he's getting it from somewhere. Likely a lot of it is raided, a lot of it is stolen. Perhaps it would make, he has a pretty much endless zombie horde. I don't know what you even need to make black powder, and if that material exists in that part of Lustria. Maybe it does, and he's able to manufacture his own. But I will say, is it magical? No. Does it work when wet? Sometimes.
Yeah. So I'd agree. And by that I mean it's not detailed, and it's hilariously undetailed, because there is quite clearly a gap there. Where the heck does it all come from? And the answer has to be that they make it themselves. Now, that doesn't mean they make all of it themselves, but they have to make it themselves because they use so much of it. It's a core component of their ships, of their troops. They have black powder, which means that they're going to have the necessary local minerals to bring it into place. The only other strong contender for it, if you don't go with that answer, is that they're using magic to create it, meaning that they're perhaps taking the ghost of the black powder. They are bringing back black powder that has been lost at sea or something similar and using that. That's a pretty weak-ass story, but it's a weak story that could, if it was written well, be exceedingly cool. And I do mean exceedingly cool, because one of the great benefits of Shyish, that's the Wind of Death, is that it has access to everything from the past. And the more powerful you are with that particular wind, the more you can gain access to things from the past using it, which means that there's more than enough potential lore there to draw in a zombie pirate explanation that kind of makes sense. but it would need some clever writing that
Yeah.
could be much more easily resolved by just simply saying they have mines, they have zombies working at it, they're building their own, and it's low grade, relatively shitty black powder. That makes much more sense.
Yeah, I will note someone asked her, sorry, I forgot the second part of Barkey's question, but this will be a good time to answer it. Is there a settlement? Yes. New Beckons
good point.
is a part of the Vampire Coast and is ruled over by Luthor Harkin. And New Beckons has a lot of living people in it. It is a place where the undead and the living coexist, which is a classic. There's also the former Bretonian colony of Brion, a little ways north, which has been played around with quite a bit. It got brought back for Total War Warhammer and is where one of the Bretonian campaigns starts. If you're playing with the Duke of Bordelot, he starts up there because he's led a fight to reclaim that colony. In fourth edition, they leave it very vague what happened to Brion, because Brion got brought up in an old white dwarf and then it was never mentioned ever again or put on any maps. So both Total War and fourth edition brought it back, and in fourth edition it's heavily implied that it fell to vampires, and that's the reason it fell in the first place, was that the Vampire Coast gobbled it up. So that would mean there are two settlements that belong to the Vampire Coast, which, there are living people there, so there could be engineers and people working in mines and stuff like that, along with zombies reinforcing them. So there's also that. And the other thing I will say is, if you're dealing with Harkin and you're writing your own stories, this could be a big reason why Harkin trades, is to get his hands on powder. But I will note there is a fun note in the Wolfrip stuff that the undead of the Vampire Coast literally dredge up sunken ships. So like if ships wreck on the coast of Lustria, they will go either draw the whole ship in, which they normally do, or at the very least they'll raid it and take everything of value, including the powder, which they'll take all the powder and take it to land, let it dry off over time or whatever, use magic or whatever have you. So there are ways they can get it, but I do agree with Andy, for them to have as much as they probably need. There's got to be shenanigans.
Yeah, they're
involved.
making it themselves. And I don't think that it's a particularly large stretch for that to be the case. It's not a complicated chemical process. So, yeah, they're making it themselves.
Yep. Hammond, why does Slanesh like us so? Also, the king of the elves. Sunfang lusts for battle! Well, if you're talking about Tyrion, he's not the king, but... That being said, perhaps Narian said the same sentence when he was wielding something. I wouldn't put it past him. Phil, I've heard that the seas of Warhammer world draw in Gyron and Gur. I'd argue Olga would be extremely common amongst the open seas as well. There's a reason humanity came up with lighthouses. Yep. How would the seafarers of the world either try to fend off the effects of the shadow wind or try and use it for their own ends while at sea?
I mean, at its very simplest, the normal mariners won't be. You've got to be a wizard to gain access to and understand the winds of magic. The normal mariners are just going to be going about their business, dealing whatever horror is inflicted upon them by either the winds of magic, the various creatures that are local, or whatever. But you'll find that the vast majority of the navies of the Warhammer world have got various spellcasters. The Empire Army, if we go back to the only few articles that have been written about their navies, carry wizards as part of their crews inside the Imperial Navy.
Which I will note is very funny, because all the Black Library writers always have it where having a wizard on board is bad luck, which is hilarious.
But yeah, they need them, because it's basically like, I mean, would you go to a war in the Warhammer world without a wizard? The answer is no. Ever, because you would get massacred. And indeed, the few examples of battles in history where people go to war without wizards are always absolute annihilation for those without them, unless they're dwarves. But remember, dwarves have wizards. They're just called runesmiths. They're basically their equivalent of wizards. So then we go over to the Empire and its various factions. It's got a bunch of battle wizards, of which Jade are super common, of which Grey are very common. They're itinerant, moving around from place to place. Gur is relatively common as well, particularly for summoning up great sea beasts from the sea to use them to try and protect against whatever might be coming in. So the answer is that your average mariner won't be using it, and your unaverage mariner is a wizard that uses magic anyway. So it's just utilizing the local winds in the same way that anybody else is. But you're absolutely spot on that the grey wind would be everywhere. All those banks of fog, for example, are going to be gathering grey wind. Plus various factions like the Vampire Coast and the great uncertainty principle of Luthor Harkin sitting at the very top, and all the politics sitting around that would also bring yet more of the grey wind and Ulgu to it. So yeah, the wind is going to be there in vast quantities, and those who can use it will, but the vast majority won't, and will just be passing through it in the hope that it doesn't do anything horrible.
Yeah, and if you're like, oh, I want a specific example of a spell, you know, hiding your ship via Olgu is wise, because there are things on the sea you should be aware of.
In fact, if you go into the Man of War game, and it is a very old game, but the colors of magic existed back then as well. They've got a whole host of like jade spells, like for example a rot spell, which makes all the wood rot on your opponent's ships by drawing out the life from it. So there's lots of fun spells for those wins as well if you want to go check out those old expansions.
Yeah, I just want to grab this real quick. Which wind does the Lord of the Deep derive from? If we look at the 8 wins, there's a big lack of anything water/naval, which I always found strange as a derivative or something completely new. So we've talked about this a fair bit in other streams about where do the bonus lores of magic come from? And that sometimes they're their own unique winds. Sometimes they're a wind spun a new way. The lore of the deeps, in particular, in Total War, is a very interesting lore because it's kind of the lore of necromancy plus water.
Plus jade.
Yeah, which in and of itself is a fascinating concept. That's not that does exist. Like there's a form of necromancy called arborea necromancy, which is the necromancy of plants, which is used to horrifying effect. There's a piece of artwork of what an undead tree creature looks like, and spoiler, it's horrifying. And so you could mix Skyrim and necromancy, despite the fact many people will go, oh, wouldn't those cancel each other out? That's not necessarily at all how it would work. That being said, there is a fun mention in Total War that the art of the Lore of the Deeps was taught or somehow manifested by Stromfels. And that Stromfels wields power over it and gives this power freely to the Vampire Coast because he favors them so heavily, which is a concept that is very odd from just a purely in-universe perspective, but I really like it. Because frankly, Stromfels would love the Vampire Coast. They represent, they're like the ultimate predators of the sea. He would adore them. And normally we have this whole idea of, oh, well, gods and vampires are always like at each other and like never get along. But I love the idea that you could explore the concept that maybe not always.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So what we've got is a lore of magic which is strongly influenced by necromancy, and necromancy is typically, if you want to just drop it down to winds, typically viewed as something like a mixture of Dar and Shyish. It's death mixed with that black magic, which makes it all the more powerful and twists it and corrupts it into something new. But it's also strongly influencing water, which is the province of Jade, generally speaking. It's the province of Gyron, controlling the flows of magic that come from with that, which would be a mixture of Gyron and Dar and Shyish. So we've got several moving here. But I think something else that Sotek says is absolutely the case. There is now so many different lores, many of which lie out with the standard 8 winds of magic, that it is a lie to say that there are 8 winds of magic in the Warhammer world. What there is in the Warhammer world is 8 great winds of magic that pretty much everyone can perceive. And there's a bunch of other magical stuff that manifests in a variety of different ways. Some of them appear like winds, some of them seem less so. So you might find that Gyron is not used here and it's something else. And I'm going to reinforce the point about Stromfels. It's a fascinating situation because the gods typically only let's take a slightly different angle. Human gods, as we understand them, give divine miracles, not magic. Other gods give magic. So that moves Stromfels from simply being the god of human pirates et al. To the god of nastiness at sea, for want of a better description, moving beyond the simple province of humanity and miracles and moving into, yes, but I also give magic. And I think that's super cool. It's a very rare example of this, though. Most of the magic that is passed on divinely from one of the gods is to one of the species that are most certainly not human, and never to the undead. I mean, the undead don't do that sort of thing. It's just a big fat no. And it's super cool that we've got one example where it might be a big fat yes. And I'm strongly in support of the Warhammer background not just simply being, this is the rule and you can never break it now. I much prefer going, this is the situation in the lore, and someone coming along and going, well, couldn't someone do this? And the answer is Yes, the gods are not limited just because we say they have to be one way. The gods can do whatever the frick they want. And Stromfels, if he wants to give magic to great big undead pirates, enough power to him. Who the hell's going to stop him? And I kind of love that.
Yeah, I will also say that I honestly think that's one of the best things that Total War Warhammer did with the Vampire Coast was tying Stromfels so deeply into the faction. Yeah, because I mean, the god of, you know, wreckers and sea monsters and bad things happening at sea, and you always have that thing of like, oh, well, like, what's the relationship? Like, you have all these priests of like humans that are like, oh, Manon and Stromfels, like, they don't fuck with each other, they fucking hate each other. And if you're running with that idea that they are genuinely different gods, the idea that Stromfels courts with and has no issue with using undead or using the dead, you know, he has dominion over the things that die at sea, would tie him very well to the Vampire Coast, and could be an explanation why, despite Manon often being a fairly destructive god, he fucking hates Stromfels. If Stromfels goes too far, and is pulling things up out of the sea to go out and drag more things down into it, which is just a fun idea to play around with.
Yep, there's definitely something there. There's a story untold, and I think it should be told by someone.
Isaac, in terms of comedic potential for factions, the Vampire Coast, I think, are up there with the Skaven, though they can certainly be horrifying too. Yes, that is another delightful thing about them. They're goofy as fuck. There's no other way of putting it. They have all the pirate charm we all love, but that comes with pirate antics, which are frankly goofy. And that's great.
Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah, that's why we love pirates. So, yeah, Pirates of the Caribbean is like, has had a very obvious effect on how Total War designed everything. I mean, to the point that when they introduced the Vampire Coast in the trailer, Luthor Harkin's theme is literally a slightly rejigged version of Captain Jack Sparrow's theme.
Yep.
Which is great. That's awesome.
Yes.
Muffin Backdicks, Yarhar! Would you say that the Vampires of the Coast are a mutt bloodline or are becoming more devolved as time moves on? This is a great question. So for those that don't know, so starting with Harkin, right? You gotta start with Big Daddy. Harkin's bloodline technically is a mystery. Nobody knows for sure what the hell he is. And they were very cheeky in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, because in the older lore, they just leave it super like, oh, nobody knows. And now there were a lot of theories among the fandom that I wonder if Luthor Harkin is somehow related to Wallach Harkin. Because they both have the same last name. They both originate from the, as far as we know, they both originate from somewhere in the old world. Maybe there's a connection, so maybe he's a blood dragon. This was picked up by the author, I want to say Josh Reynolds, who came along with his Masters of Death series, and there's a scene during, it's like right after the fall of Lamia, where Stragos is rising up, the nation of Stragos, and in it we see Abarash turns up, and Abarash has his 5 OG disciples with him. So the 5 biggest badasses that he ever turned, who are his personal disciples. And 2 of them are revealed as Wallach Harkin and Luthor Harkin, seeming that Harkin has something to do with being in this inner circle, that Harkin means something to the lineage of Abarash. And everyone looked at that and went, oh, awesome, we got confirmation. That makes sense. Great. Awesome. Cool. Awesome. And then nobody else ever messed with it ever again. The Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition does the smart thing of Harkin gives essentially interviews to several individuals that he captures, being high elves, dark elves, humans, and then he lets them go. But the thing is that he tells them all different things, because depending on what mood he's in, there are some threads of what he says that match up. But when it comes to like where he comes from, he says a couple different things. In one story, he says, oh, I'm from the Empire. I named that city over there New Beckhofen because I remember Beckhofen. But to another one, he says, no, I remember Nehekara. I was there. I remember ancient Nehekara. I was there when Lamia fell. And then to another one, he's like, oh, yeah, no, I don't remember even when I became a vampire. Like, I remember being a necromancer, and then one day I was just a vampire, and I don't really remember what happened. He kind of has a pick your own choice background. I would say that from a cultural zeitgeist, so like the community very strongly is, oh, he's a blood dragon. He's a direct descendant of Abarash, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's also not a mutt. Something we talked about back in the Vlad stream or the Lamia stream is there's a whole thread running through Warhammer Fantasy of that vampires can get the blood kiss multiple times from other bloodlines, and it makes them more powerful and makes them into mutts. And I would say it is borderline impossible to say that he probably did not run into vampires of other bloodlines, likely von Karsteins, LAWmians, and augment himself before he arrived in the New World. And the vampires that arrived there, most of them are believed to have been turned by Harkin himself, but not all. There are, I would say very strongly, others in his court from other bloodlines who were drawn to him from other parts of the world. Your von Karsteins, your LAWmians, your Necrarchs, who would be very interested in Harkin. He's a weird freak. Experiment-wise, Necrarchs would be obsessed with him. But once again, that's not super well explored. As far as would I say they're a mutt bloodline? It's hard to say that in the sense that the vast majority of them would be descended from Harkin.
Yeah, so I broadly agree, and by that I say that we've got ourselves a bloodline that is from uncertain source, and I would prefer it stayed that way. And you'll tend to find that if we turn to what Warhammer will produce in future, if they, for example, ever do a Vampire Coast Army list, the likelihood that they will simply say that is enormously high, because what's sitting inside one novel is enormously unlikely to influence what the core writers of the battle game are going to use. Because, as I've said on more than one occasion, the novels are loads of additional details that are considered to be fine for those novels, but they are not considered to be the canon of the battle game. The battle game goes in its own direction at all times. That being the case, the bloodline of Harkin is going to be his. And the likelihood of it being tied to someone else is probably low until they decide to do like a big campaign story. And suddenly it's revealed and it's what nobody expected. That being the case, I would suggest mutt bloodline is perhaps the wrong way to view it. I'd instead say it's the Luthor Harkin bloodline and that they are pirate vampires. Are they devolved? No, they're just pirate vampires. They're the pirate vampire line. They've got their own pirate vampire powers. They've got their pirate vampire spells, and they do pirate vampire things. And that's as developed as you're likely to get for them.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to power... Man, y'all are being very... thank you for all the questions.
Yeah,
we really
thanks.
appreciate
Awesome.
it.
I'm really
probably
enjoying
around like 1:45 mark, I'm going to stop questions and just get into some general lore tidbits. Luckily, through answering a lot of the questions, we've hit a lot of the major things, but there are some other things to discuss.
Yeah.
Charles C.K. For an average human, which of the more native Lester groups, vampires, Lisbon, Skaven, Amazon, etc., is easiest to understand and or work with? The other humans.
Humans.
There are a lot of humans in Lestria.
Humans.
So this is a misconception I want to hit really hard. Of that, there are a lot of colonies. There's more colonies than you think in Lestria. A lot of people. B, there are significantly more humans in Lestria than you think, because there's often a concept where people will look at Lestria from the sake of the colonies and go, oh, so there were no humans whatsoever in Lestria before the coming of the colonies, which is not necessarily true. The Amazons are a good example of a huge question mark of what are they. Most of the most important sources would tell you they're not actually human. They look human, but they're not. There's something other. But one of the things that I've always felt very strongly is likely to change in the future is that the idea that there's no other humans whatsoever that have formed their own tribes or split off and learned to live in the jungle in the at least 2,000-ish years that humans have been on Lestria. I mean, humans have been there for a long fucking time.
And originally there was humans all over those jungles as well, if you go with the original lore. The original lore had them, but they were such poor racist stereotypes that Warhammer largely dropped it. And I think for probably very good reason at the time. But that doesn't mean they won't return there. The big reason that Lustria doesn't have many of these extra smaller groups is because so very few books have gone into detail outside of what is required for the battle game. That being the case, you tend to find that when the battle game does its, let's say, description of Lustria, they focus on lizardmen, Skaven, lizardmen, Skaven, and forget about the rest. And then we get the Total War game that comes along and goes, well, there's some dwarves up there and there's a bunch of colonies, and then, hey, over there you got the Vampire Coast as well. There's other factions. And then the role-playing game comes along. The role-playing game focuses on exactly the same shit. Lizardmen, Skaven, and then also says, oh yeah, but all that stuff from the old world, it's there too, so you can roleplay with it. Yeah! And then completely forget about the actual place itself and the vast area that it covers and the many likely pockets of civilization that live throughout it. And civilization doesn't just mean, big cities, wherever it could be. Various tribal groups that are making their way through the vast, deep, and extraordinarily difficult to live in circumstances that are the Lustrian jungles, many of which will have adapted to what is, in many places, the absolute horror show that has been created by the Slann, who've changed these into worse than a death world of Catachan in some places. So, yeah, there's going to be all kinds of local peoples that are down there, none of which have really been detailed, but have been kind of hinted at the periphery all over the place.
Yeah, that being said, of the groups provided, weirdly enough, the Vampire Coast would probably be the easiest to deal with.
Which is hilarious.
Yeah, because they at least are very old world leaning. Like they speak the same languages and they understand you. The Amazons would be the next closest, but the Amazons are very insular. They do not like outsiders. They're very spooky. A lot of people don't realize how fucking terrifying the Amazons are. People stay away from them, and for good reason. Yeah, funny enough, I would actually say the Vampire Coast. Cameo, playing Vampire Coast while listening, was wondering how likely greater undead alliances are in the absence of the gash. Depends on what's going on. Generally speaking, vampires like to be in charge, and it's often hard for them to establish a pecking order because they get in fights pretty easily. And the Vampire Coast are very far removed from everything else going on. That being said, it just depends. They happen. They're moments of convenience, but they're often pretty dramatic events when you get greater alliances of undead, because that means shit's hitting the ceiling. And you often have stuff like the Tomb Kings really fucking hate vampires as kind of a universal rule. That's honestly what makes like Archon the Black such a big deal. Is Archon the Black basically is the ambassador of the undead. He'll treat with any of the undead, and it makes him a big nightmare in that where he goes, history changes because he often is getting vampires to work with him or Tomb Kings to work with him or other groups like that. That being said, vampires wandering over to the Vampire Coast and making alliances with Harkin, quite likely. And that having some disastrous results for various factions until the alliance inevitably falls apart and Harkin kills them, also quite likely.
Yeah. Generally speaking, the great thing to remember with the undead is that undead armies are often extraordinary personalities leading great swathes of idiots. So if you're looking for alliances, you're looking for those personalities having a reason to work together. In this case, Luthor Harkin or one of the various lieutenants that might be found up and down the coast. So in the case of the undead Tomb Kings, it's the individual Tomb Kings. In the case of your vampire counts, it's the individual vampires. In the case of various liches, whatever else you might find, necromancers across the old world and similar, they would need to have a reason to work together. But often these individuals are filled with a great sense of megalomaniacal control, largely because of the dark wind that they're channeling. Dark wind, the black wind of magic, corrupts you from within and makes you typically pretty weird, often deeply focused on power and gathering power, which means that because of this jealous nature that many of them will have over controlling that power, many of the necromancers and vampires and similar will not be allying unless they are absolutely forced to or must, because they'll generally have a mindset that says, I'll do it better myself, generally.
Yeah. Aaron Katona, thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, what are your opinions of Luthor Harkin being a Lamian / Blood Dragon? I think he revolves around magic too much for Blood Dragon things, but his name is Harkin. So one thing I want to dispel right here is the idea that all Blood Dragons are bad at magic. That is not true.
It's not true.
There are several Blood Dragons that we have examples who are take the Red Duke. The Red Duke is one of the fucking scariest vampires in the entire setting. And the only thing holding him back is that he's completely fucking insane because he got trapped in a coffin for hundreds of years alone in the pitch dark and couldn't feed on anything, which, to be fair, would make anyone insane. But before that whole incident, the Red Duke, sorcery-wise, was horrifically powerful. Like, he goes toe-to-toe with the likes of, like, the Fey Enchantress and other really powerful wizards, and was a nightmare to deal with. So the idea that blood dragons are just universally bad at magic is a hefty overgeneralization of the bloodline. There are select individuals that are noted as being pretty bad at it. Abarash is noted for not being very good at it. Luthor Harkin is not a very powerful wizard. But Luthor and the Red Duke are obscenely strong in their primes. Though hilariously, both of them fall to madness, though a different kind of madness. That being said, like Andy, we talked about earlier, is he guaranteed a blood dragon? No. He could be a Lamian. He could be a von Karstein. He could be something. He could be the Forgotten Bloodline from like the Southlands that nobody really knows about. Who knows?
Yeah, given the quality of the character as a whole, it wouldn't be surprising if it was a Blood Dragon or a Karstein. Both of those make, I would argue, better sense than, say, a Lamian. Both of those fit in pretty well, but that doesn't mean that he is. And I kind of like it and prefer it being in that direction. Him being an uncertain character strengthens the unique nature of the Vampire Coast, rather than tying it in and saying, oh no, he's just one of those, which immediately makes the Warhammer world feel a little bit smaller. I like it having areas where you go, where does this one come from? We don't know. Particularly given that Luthor himself at one point goes, I made myself, didn't I? Yeah.
Yeah. I just woke up one day. Shadizian, thank you for the super chat. Hey guys, starting to see why the Empire would ply the high seas beyond trade. New world colonies seem too small. Any bigger Empire sea colonies? Well, first of all, welcome to nation, or like the age of imperialism. Empire wants to get in on that. Bretonnia wants to get in on that. Estalia and Talea want to get in on that. Conquering the new world. Think of all the wealth and riches. There's gold on them shores. Yeah, they're empires. They want to expand. Now, it just happens to be that their version of South America is horrifically more nasty to invaders than our version was. So they're having a hard time with it. That being said, the New World colonies, they are many of them are probably a bit larger than you think they are, have higher populations than you may think. This is often due to the fact that me and Andy have talked about this before. If you go watch like the Altdorf stream, for instance, Warhammer writers tend to grossly underestimate how many people should be in a place for how long they've been there. Many of the old world the new world colonies have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And even
yet they're still a tiny colony. Really?
Yeah. And that's more of a flaw of the setting and the fact that GW writers don't often know history very well. They just don't.
Yeah, but, it's unfortunate.
But are there any other notable colonies? Not that are really well talked about, but I would say, yeah. Like the idea that there isn't empire colonies somewhere in like colony might not necessarily be the right term, but like empire settlements in like the Kingdoms of End, or on the colony on the shores of Koresh, or in other bizarre places throughout the world, I find extremely unlikely. Like empire's gonna empire. That's what they do. And these empires have been around for thousands of years. Ain't no way they're just sitting there not doing anything.
Yeah, totally. The Empire has, at various points, moved out by boat, but you've got to remember that the Warhammer world is a little bitty different to the real world in that it has existing empires out on the oceans, which fiercely protect it. In this particular instance, we've got the High Elves, who, as far as they're concerned, they own the high seas. And we have the Dark Elves, who, as far as they're concerned, they own the high seas. And anybody that transgresses them tends to get sunk, meaning that you don't have that easy expanse of water where your only competitors are other empires back in the old world. It's quite different. Just going out there is an extraordinary risk, and you're probably going to die. So the core concept of empire building is simply different in the Warhammer world to how it is in the real world to start off with. But nevertheless, the idea that higher technology peoples will come in and try to take control of lower technology peoples, and the potential, not just colonialization of that, but the attempt to control others through that, seems to me not just likely, very likely, and it hasn't really been mined much, but there's going to be more of it, I'm sure.
Yeah, honestly, the Southlands in particular is an area where you would expect to see significantly more colonies. but the Southlands Games Workshop just does not think it exists the vast majority of the time.
Let's just not think about that too much.
Yeah, like the Southlands, Lustria has significantly more lore than the Southlands does, which makes no fucking sense for how close the Southlands is to the old world. So that being said, the largest colony I know of would actually probably be the penal colony of Sudenburg, which is down north.
Way.
Yeah, it's not down in the jungles. It's just north of that in that the coast of Tusks, I think. That one's pretty big.
Yeah.
Let's see. What would it be to channel Gyran in the coast? Like, could you? I mean, the ocean's right there, so you could. Yeah. It might be a little funky, but you could.
Yeah. There's Gyran flows across the land in great massive channels and flows towards and into oceans as well, and across oceans. Gyran is closely associated with water. It would be an easy place to channel Gyran magic, but it's also worth noting that Gyran magic, unlike many of the other winds, is a particularly easy wind to channel. So it wouldn't necessarily be all that much easier, but it would definitely be pretty easy in comparison to some of the other winds.
Yeah, especially because the Vampire Coast is actually cut up by 5 rivers that go from Lustria into the ocean, which for those who want to hear, from north to south, the rivers that cut through the Vampire Coast are the Shingo River, the Pakotl River, the Tieto River, the Aboxi River, and the Kahuatl River. So there you go. Tiblam, I thought the Galleon Graveyard was ripping off all the dead things in the ocean. So would lower undead get insta exercise if they fall off of the boat? Does that compromise the Vampire Coast submarine unit? So one of the things we talked about a little bit earlier, but I want to really hammer on is when Luthor Harkin showed up on the Vampire Coast, one of the things he did very early was he used the incredible amount of death magic and other sorceries that he was able to build up on the coast, and he cast a really nasty ritual, which draws any ships that get vaguely close to the Vampire Coast towards it. This is done through a series of methods. He employs the use of what are known as sirens, but because it's the Vampire Coast, it's spelled sirens.
Because of course it is.
Yeah, because if it's a siren, that's something technically different in the old world. So they're like, well, we want to have the same thing, but we have to spell it different. That way it's unique. So we got the sirens, which are, instead of being like mermaid-like creatures, they're spirits. They're very similar to banshees that sing and lure sailors to their doom. That's a part of the ritual. Other aspects of it are that there's a cursed mist that hovers around the Vampire Coast that causes people to get lost and slam into the very, very dangerous shores of the Vampire Coast. He basically, so like think of like how Ulthuan has a big ritual off the eastern coast, the Shifting Isles, that confuses people and causes them to shipwreck and go places they don't mean to. Luthor Harkin has basically designed something very, very similar. It's just its goal is to bring you in instead of to kind of push you out like the Shifting Isles necessarily. That being said, a Vampire Coast submarine unit is hilarious. Also, the idea of them getting sucked into the Galleon's Graveyard like a vacuum is hilarious. But also keep in mind, if you watch the Galleon Graveyard stream, me and Andy talked a lot about that the Galleon's Graveyard is 99% not where Total War puts it. Total War put it there to make it relevant and to just give you a fun thing near Ulthuan. It is far more likely that it's on the other side of Lustria. Way super fucking far away. So it's nowhere close to the Vampire Coast.
Yeah, and the general comment here that the Galleon's Graveyard yanks everything down there, generally that is correct eventually, but consider it like gravity. That distant thing, you're going to get there eventually, but there's a far closer source of gravity that's coming from the Vampire Coast. So the undead there get pulled into that area first, and we'll have a good stomping around there. And if they sink elsewhere, they very much could go down to that graveyard. One of the mistakes generally with the Warhammer world is to accept the lore when it says all of these are that, because every time you read that, you then go, right, I've got it, I understand that. You go read another book and it says, over here, it's like this. And you're like, but it says over there that all of those are different to that. What? So what you tend to find with Warhammer lore is that they speak in categorical terms. This is the most powerful example of this. There is nothing that's more powerful than this. This is the greatest example of this. Everything that dies here goes there. And then the actual specific examples all over the place contradict those mighty categorical statements all the time. So whilst yes, the Galleon's Graveyard is an inevitable destination for all of those, go check our stream about that, that in no way means everything's going to get there, but certainly not instantly. It'll take time, things go down there slowly, the sea is a weird place, there's fishmen. Who's to say the fishmen don't get involved? Tridents abound, there's good old Tritons swimming around doing crazy stuff, vampires doing vampire stuff, other things doing other stuff. It's a massive, complicated set of affairs with, at the very bottom of it, that great maw nibbling away at everything the sea offers. But in no way does that mean you're all going to go there immediately. So it doesn't in any way compromise anything the Vampire Coast is doing, but it is a consistent part of what lies at the background of the Vampire Coast existence.
Yeah, I like to think of the Galleon's Graveyard more like entropy, in that it's this very weak but constant source of pull. But literally everything else seems to have a stronger magnetic pull. It's more the Galleon Graveyard is where you go when you are truly lost to the sea.
Yeah.
Cole Patterson, are the old world, new world plants from similar places as they are in our world? Is Harkin selling potatoes, tomatoes, and chocolate to passing merchants? That is a genuinely great question that the writers of Games Workshop would very much prefer you not ask them.
So chocolate is something that has been a part of the Warhammer world almost since the beginning. So it's definitely in the old world. And there have been various attempts by some writers to say, aha, it comes through the wasteland and it comes in through Marienburg. And others who say, no, they've got it from other sources. So I think the answer is somewhat generally for much of this, yes, but potatoes have been in the old world for a very, very long time now, probably hundreds and hundreds of years, and are grown locally, and as are tomatoes. Chocolate, that's much less certain. So the answer in general is Harkonnen probably does have access to a host of interesting crop types, as do others that are sitting over in the New World, and far more crop types than simply real world equivalents. Take, for example, ice peppers that you get in Kislev. Ice peppers are like a bell pepper, but they give you a menthol like numbing rather than, you know, a hot pepper, which gives you, oh shit, it's hot. So you've got yourself various crops which you'll only get in the Warhammer world because of the magic that flows through it, or because it was changed by the old ones, or because some crazy wizard did some crazy wizard shit and they've managed to make some crazy wizard ship crop. So they are going to have stuff. As to whether that's ever properly traded by what are a bunch of pirates, well, that's down to individual writers and what they decide to do with it. And it is ultimately something that, as Sotek says, many writers forget about or would just rather you didn't think about, because they're far more interested in having large units beat living crap out of each other for whatever novel they're working on.
All right, and I'm going to leave the next comment for a little bit later, because there's some things I want to talk about, and I'm just keeping an eye on the time that I want to get through before.
Yeah, look at the time. It's already quarter two. Yeah,
we appreciate the deluge of questions.
Massively do. Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, it's been awesome. So, the Vampire Coast is the northeastern shore of Lustria that is made up of the Pox Marshes in the north and then the Blood Swamps further south. It's over 1,000 miles of land that is made up of pretty hefty, nasty marshes that eventually give way to the beaches of Lustria, which are, you know, your typical beaches, nothing particularly exciting. And like I said earlier, you have 5 rivers that are dumping out of them. Luthor Harkin is the true origin, as far as the Vampire Coast itself is concerned, of what it will become. Now, it's always been a dangerous shoreline. There were many vessels from other races that had wrecked before the arrival of Harkin. His was just another one. There are High Elves and Dark Elves and Norskins and other early human nations that were exploring the world and got too close to the Vampire Coast and died, because it is extremely treacherous. It is an absolute mess. in that part of the world. But when it comes to 1 second, I'm just making sure that my family does not absolutely need me for something. Anyway, why can I hear myself talking? Oh, that's why. Okay, sorry about that. Just making sure there wasn't an emergency. So Harkin arrives in 876 of the Imperial calendar. Now, what's interesting about his arrival is, as the tales talk about, Harkin did not intend to go to Lustria. Now, why exactly he was on an Imperial trading vessel that was in that part of the world is not explicitly stated. It's left in a mystery in all the original stories. In the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, Harkin himself says something along the lines of that he was fleeing through the port of Marienburg during the 9th century from a, what was this guy's name? An emperor, supposedly, the witch hunter emperor, Joachim II of the 9th century. Who I've never heard of, but he's probably only existed in this
made
book.
Up for that book. I find it quite interesting because it also contradicts the early lore where it was Norse. Norse.
The Norse show up. The Norse show up. So in the original story, it is an Imperial merchant vessel that gets attacked by the Norse.
The original one, it's just the Norse.
Oh, maybe back in like the Elizabeth. Sorry.
Yeah,
in the White Dwarf, in the 2005 version.
When they replace it later, they go, actually, no. The Norse raided, took, and that was probably a really bad idea.
Yeah, so this trading vessel that left through the port of Marienburg gets attacked by Norskins at some point along its route, and they take everything on board, including a coffin, which, you know, I'm sure there's nothing bad in there. And they take it on board and continue on their vessel, and what happens next is vague. That it's not sure if it's like the story that obviously inspires it, being the story of Dracula, where Dracula would wake up and prey on and terrorize the crew until they inevitably shipwreck, or if the Norskins were just carrying on their merry business and then got too close to the Vampire Coast and wrecked because that's what the Vampire Coast does to people. But regardless, Luthor Harkin's vessel crashes into the Vampire Coast, and Harkin is, depending on which version of the story you look at, either the only survivor or one of two survivors, with some stories being that his first mate is the only other survivor, being that he turns them into a ghoul according to 4th edition, or he turns them into a vampire according to the end times. But either way, he wrecks and he stomps out of his boat and looks around the Vampire Coast and takes a big old whiff of a saturation of shyish that is naturally drawn through this area because of the fetid marshes and all of the dead that have wrecked here over the centuries. And he goes, I can work with this. This is pretty nice. And he sets up shop. And for a good while, he is basically left alone to just start being a mess. And now, one of the things that's really interesting is that how long it takes for Harkin to lose his mind is not specified. In some versions of the story, Harkin basically sets up shop, and only 12 years later, in 888, he tries to invade Lustria and is repelled by the Lizardmen.
I find this, just as a small intro, I find this section super fascinating, because what we have is the arrival of Harkin with the Norse. The Norse by this point are undead. None of them survive. They're undead. And he pops into the shore with his small crew of undead Norse. And this is the foundation point. And he doesn't have great armies. They just don't exist. Yet somewhere he draws great human armies in, and in the initial version of it, it's actually hilarious by how badly they don't describe where they come from. They often loosely give a sentence along the lines of, and he draws in undead from the depths of the water of all the dead folk who happen to be there. That'll do it. We've got our pirate zombies. Yes! So that's how he gets them in. But regardless of which version you go with as to how he got it, what marches into the jungles of Lustria, not more than just a decade or so later, is a big horde of undead pirates. There's just a big horde of pirates right from the beginning, and he's got this huge number, and they are, just to re-stress this, human. These are not lizardmen that he has resurrected. These are not Skaven that he's resurrected. These are not looking at the local corpses and saying, what have I got a lot of? I've got a lot of these. It's an ancient battlefield of humans. No, it's far more likely you're going to find corpses of elves down there that have been sunk by the various awfulnesses that could be found in this area. The area is almost certainly filled with not just ancient corpses of lizardmen, but relatively recent ones also, because the lizardmen have been in the area forever. The only way you could in any way suggest that there's possibly a lot of handy humans here is if you go with the whole, well, at the beginning of time, the humans that were in the old one's control, a bunch of them fell and went to war with the lizardmen here. Yeah? No, it's bullshit. They don't have quite the numbers. So clearly we have a gap in the story here where Luthor has managed to draw in a huge chunk of pirates, or the Vampire Coast has long been a wrecking point of pirates. But the timing doesn't work for this, because this is 900. At 900, they're barely better than tribesmen. They don't have ocean-going vessels in the Empire, for example. They don't have great, massive clippers. The best ships on the sea are the Norse. It's the Norse. They don't have this big, huge Empire great ship with cannons. That doesn't come for about another 1,000 years. We are way
this would be a very melee heavy. More typical vampire count army.
Yeah, totally. So what we have, if we're going with the background we have established, is probably a ton of Norse folk, or arguably slaves that were taken by the Dark Elves across and then had wrecked here, and that's the ones he's resurrected.
There's a very convenient dead bleached black arc right there. He's like, oh, how nice!
Yeah. I think the only one that makes any real sense is that Luthor himself has been able to drag the dead in across the deep, perhaps dead that are being sucked down to the Galleon's graveyard, and pulled them in for his great piratical mess. But if that's the case, even then we have some very weird stories that we need to resolve, and what we get within this first decade up to about, I think it's about 930 when he does his first major attacks.
Yes.
That's off the top of my head. I hope I'm right.
Well, an interesting thing here. This is actually an interesting retcon, which is why I want to bring it up. Interestingly, 888 was originally a date important to Luthor Harkin in some of the older books of, this is his first big invasion, and there's a whole prophecy about defeating him. But later writers looked at it and went, oh no, that's too soon, and backed it up to 930. But some books have kept it of, he attacks in 888, but it's just a very small, it's like his initial penetration into the jungle, and he's just been building up since then because he knew it was going to be nasty, which is interesting. So later authors basically took it of that his first probing of Lustria was in 888, and then his first full invasion is in 930. But
I think that sort of makes sense. That's still 12 years, but still 12 years is a lot.
I want to point out something really silly, is that Luthor Harkin supposedly arrives in 876 and builds up enough of a horrifying undead army that has ships sailing through the cursed mists of the Vampire Coast that the High Elves see it, make note of it, and go, stay the fuck away from there.
Stay away from there, yeah.
But Lost Erickson, who discovers Lustria, doesn't show up until 888, which means Luthor Harkin apparently has enough undead to rise into a great army 12 years before Lustria has been discovered by Old Worlders.
The dates here don't make sense, and turning them all into early vampire pirates also doesn't make sense. It would have made, I would argue, a better sense to say in the beginning he had this. He summoned up the undead and the corpses in the local area. Lots of skeletons rising out of this horrible boggy marsh from perhaps ancient battles from time past, and using what was there. And over the course of time, the large number of pirates that landed in the area over the course of the next several centuries changed the tone of the area. That would have made arguably more sense, but kind of no.
Yeah, also, I apologize earlier. I said Brion because my brain is stupid. I meant Liang Gui. No. I was right. It was Brion. Never mind. I take it back. Brion. I don't apologize. So, interestingly, there's that whole mess, which is a whole stupid, goofy thing.
It's a bit of a mess up. It needs a writer to come along in and focus on it.
I'll put it this way. To be very, very blunt, if I were rewriting Luthor Harkin, he really probably doesn't need to show up until like 1,000 years after that. Like, he could have showed up in the 1800s and his story would make so much more sense. And you just kind of update all the dates, because like none of his stuff is super important that he does in the grand scheme. He shows up way earlier than he needs to.
What the problem is that Luthor Harkin has been saddled with the date that he got in the Undead Army list all the way back in 1994, and that 876 arrival date has stayed in place since then, but the tone of the Vampire Coast changed and it turned into the Vampire Pirate area. And instead of saying this is the area that's now Vampire Pirates, they kind of say Luthor Harkin's a vampire pirate and all of the people here have always been vampire pirates and they've been doing this for ages, and it sort of doesn't make sense. And it really needs a writer to just come in and say, yeah, you know that thing that was said over there, let's rationalize that, let's make this bit make sense, let's make Luthor Harkin make sense, let's make his madness be a part of that. His madness that he gets eventually later can pretty much cover most of the uncertain details, because as we've suggested, most of the details that we have about the Vampire Coast are often from his perspective. So we can say it was almost anything to begin with. We can say that the first attacks and what they were doing could be for very different reasons, with not vampire pirates, but just your classic undead, or even undead of local tribes folk that Luthor Harkin has brought underneath his sway. There's lots of stuff that could be done here to make a great deal of sense of an ancient Luthor Harkin who's been in the area, who nowadays is a mad pirate king. And he wasn't originally a mad pirate king. He was probably originally something very different. An extraordinarily capable sorcerer, of that we're pretty certain, who was capable of using the great swirl of dark magic that he found himself in, and arguably he guided the Norse vessel too. It's not so much it crashed, it's almost certainly that that's where he wanted to end up when he spelt it, pulling him in that direction, using that as a story plot, and then the very magics that he himself was trying to manipulate drive him mad and send him over the line.
Yeah. So, that being said, with that whole thing out of the way of dates being dates, like Andy said, in 930 we get the first big invasion, and this very much seems to be before Luthor Harkin loses his mind. That he leads a fucking gigantic invasion. And one of the things that's interesting is, according to the older lore of the White Dwarf article, which this is not contested by the newer lore, so it still could be considered canon, there is a Slaawn that is aware of Harkin named Lord Zeltip, and he's down in Itza, which once again, long way away. And Lord Zeltip,
really far away.
Yeah, which, you know, Zvanhapek, which is the city of Mist, is right next to where Harkin is.
Yeah.
But it's Lord Zeltip that becomes aware of him and decides that he needs to be dealt with. And according to the original story, Lord Zeltep casts a spell on Harkin from all the way in Itza, where he basically pulls at threads in Harkin's mind to try and make him more greedy, more aggressive. And it causes Harkin, supposedly, the Slaawn are established to be able to do this, though it's used very rarely as a power. So Harkin eventually gets like, yeah, it's time. And he leads a gigantic fucking army of zombies crashing through the jungles of Leicester, and he's heading south. And he basically is heading towards Itza, essentially. And as he's plowing his way through the jungles, he gets within several hundred miles northeast of that. The armies of Itza march out to meet him. And the big battle breaks out where Nakai the Wanderer shows up, and the armies of Itza, along with Nakai the Wanderer, face off against the forces of Luthor Harkin. And this ends up fulfilling a big old prophecy, which is the prophecy of Huanca's Lampek, which interestingly means the old ones knew this was going to happen. And they put it on their sacred plaques and said, one day a vampire is going to show up with a big zombie army, and when these astrological signs align, you need to go deal with it. And Lord Zeltep goes, okay. And he does. And they kick the crap out of Harkin and send him tailing back to the Vampire Coast with his army pretty heavily shattered for a good while. What's interesting is that from this point, it changes a bit. Also, hilariously, there's a lot of retconning around that particular fight, because if you go back into older lore, there's actually a different prophecy and it was actually Lord Mazdamundi who fights Harkin. That Mazdamundi comes all the way down from Hexwaddle, which is a really far away place, way up there, and he kicks the crap out of Harkin and fulfills a different prophecy. But different versions kept disagreeing with each other, and they finally ended up settling on no, it's Lord Zeltep that does it. But the Wanderer shows up. Neat. But Harkin is pushed back after a big ugly battle. And Harkin at this point just kind of kicks around, and it's at some point in this ballpark that he likely loses his mind. And what essentially happens is that Harkin starts having a lot of good success against the ruins of the Lizardmen along that coastline. Most notably, Axolotl, which is a very important city. I think it's called the Star City, if I remember correctly, is a ruin that he successfully sacks in 1351. He does a great job. He pillages it. He gets a lot of really cool Slon goodies that further enhance his powers and abilities. But one thing that Harkin starts to run into is that there's a geomantic nexus line that runs essentially north to south through a series of Lizardmen ruins that has its focal point in the city of Waddle, which is another fallen ruin of the Lizardmen. And Harkin realizes that his magic runs into problems trying to get past this line. It's basically like a disruption point that if the undead try to cross it, a lot of them just like collapse and fall over just dead. And Harkin goes, well, okay, that's a problem. And so he tracks this nexus point to the city of Waddle, which the Lizardmen have had an on and off again relationship of trying to rebuild, where they've shown up, they've rebuilt parts of it, and then they leave. And then they show up again, they rebuild parts of it, and then they leave. And Harkin shows up when it's abandoned. And because the Lizardmen have been coming back to it occasionally, they've restored some of its defenses. And there's a deep chamber vault where Harkin senses something of incredible sorcery, and a magic item of nightmarish potential. And he decides, I must have it. I must have it. Not only will it disrupt this point, but it will make me even more powerful. And so he sends his undead in, but there are wards around the entrance to this vault, and the second the undead step past it, the witch fire in their eyes, the magic animating them, gone, turns off. They just fall over like puppets with their strings cut. And it keeps happening. So Harkin finally decides, fuck it, I'll do it myself. And he basically walks into the chamber. He forces himself through the wards, forces himself into this underground chamber. And I love the way it describes of that he unleashes his full might against the wards. So he basically gets in a magical duel with these ancient protective wards of the old ones. And it is if you were to witness it, it would be ridiculous level scale magic being thrown around. But Harkin did not realize that there was a problem, which is that one of the ward's defense mechanisms is that if it sensed something trying to attack it magically, it basically took in that magic and redirected it back at the caster. So the whole time that Harkin is blasting this thing, trying to force his way through and break it, what he doesn't realize is he's basically filling up a gas tank. And eventually it reaches the point where it fires back at him. And it's almost now that I think about it, it's almost kind of a recreation of what happened with the Dark Elves in the Vortex, where Kalidor Dragon Chamber basically took a baseball bat and just smacked their spell back at them. Same thing happened to Harkin. His spell bounces back at him, and it just fucks him up. It hits him, it breaks him, and it's the explosion of magic is so over the top that the chamber basically kind of implodes and it starts collapsing in on itself. And Harkin, through sheer force of will, drags himself crawling out of the chamber before it completely collapses, burying everything, including the artifact he wanted. And he is broken. It is said that his mind is shattered into over a dozen fragments, and his connection with the winds of magic is completely and utterly severed, which for a vampire is freaky as fuck.
Yep. It's huge. It's a little bit like going blind. you've lost yourself access to one of your core senses and your core abilities, particularly given for a vampire who, by this point, has shown himself extraordinarily capable with magic, has been using magic, one presumes, for all of its own life, and almost certainly is quite ancient, far older than the I've arrived in Lustria around about 800 or whatever, probably much older than that. And up to this point, we've seen several large workings of spells, the big siren spells to pull all of the various ships that come past into it so that they can crash and be turned into undead. And the other thing I will note on that, just to reinforce, is that we're still early enough that this is the point when the High Elves have banned anyone from the high seas. So there are no ships. Let's be blunt. There aren't any, except for High Elves. So if this was being done with the background as it stands, all of the various troops that he would have access to would be almost all High Elf vessels and slaves captured from the Dark Elves. There are almost nothing else on the high seas, but we have ourselves a different version of history being put into place here purely to justify the story that we have for the Vampire Coast. Because the story of the Vampire Coast is clear. We have, by the time that we hit our vampire lord who is shattered, by this point there is already an enormous swathe of undead in this area who have been dragged into and wrecked in this area and summoned back up as zombies, skeletons, et al. Our vampire pirates, as we relatively well know. But the overall Warhammer world at this point simply doesn't have this level of technology in place yet. Even if you look at the Lustria book, which came out a bit later, and they're going in 1400, and it's definitely not 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, honest, but basically riffing on that, they're saying the new corridor had opened, they're managing to get themselves over to Lustria for the first time, and then they're like, but Harkin's been here for the last 600 years. Wrecking vessels from over there.
He's quite literally been subsisting himself purely on Norse skins.
Yes, it's a proper crazy setup which has never been properly justified. So what we can say with absolute certainty is that we have ourselves a large undead force in the Vampire Coast led by Luthor, who goes utterly insane after making a somewhat unwise maneuver against an ancient artifact of the old ones.
Yeah. That being said, his story does start to make a lot more sense after this. Like, we get our first major chaos invasion from the mortals, Warriors of Chaos, only 20 years later. There's a ton of corpses right there. A big old chaos invasion. That's perfect for Harkin.
Perfect.
Now, Harkin, for the most part, after his big defeat in 930 and his mind shattering, isn't really much of an issue. He does, like I said, he sacked a few ruins, but he's for the most part kept contained. And after the incident at Waddle, a group of Slann actually go to Axolotl, the Star City, and they become the I forget what they're the four. It's four Slann that basically are floating really, really, really high up on these pillars, and they're just sitting there, just doing something. Protected against the elements and people from messing with them because they have these barriers around them, and they never come down. They never talk to anyone. Elizabeth don't even know what they're doing up there, but they're doing something. And Harkin realizes that they are also a problem for him, but he also can't get to him, and that's a major point of frustration for him, as they are maintaining that geomantic line, which is what some writers say, oh, that's what they're doing. Or Axolotl, whatever.
While you have a slight pause, I've just changed my settings. Hopefully I'm a little bit louder for those who said it's quiet.
If anything, I think you got a little bit quieter.
Oh, gosh darn it. Screw my mics, I'll fix them afterwards. You're just going to have to deal with me whispering in the background like a crazy zombie.
Yeah. Go back to whatever it was. go back.
Damn it. God damn.
That being said, the next major event that catapults, and understandably catapults, Luthor Harkin back into being a major threat for Lustria is 1681, also known as the Night of the Restless Dead. And this is the night where Nagash returns. Nagash comes back to the mortal realms, and when Nagash returns to reality, it is so bad that all of the dead across the entire planet get up and start roving around for a night of madness and horror the world over. And all of the dead of Lustria get up And Luthor Harkin goes, mighty convenient. Look at all these new soldiers I just got. And the ranks of the Vampire Coast explode. Absolutely explode. And he takes huge advantage of this. Gathering to himself ghosts and revenants and zombies and skeletons and all sorts of other crazy stuff. Because although another thing that I will point out that I find funny about the Vampire Coast is that it's a zombie faction, despite the fact that that would mean that all the dead would be like relatively recently dead because they still have flesh on them, despite the fact it would almost entirely be a purely skeletal horde because of how humid and nasty and all the predators and fauna and stuff of Lustria. It probably wouldn't be a zombie army. It'd probably be a skeleton army. But, zombies work more fun for pirates in a lot of people's opinion. So whatever theme.
Totally. They're zombie pirates. Live with it, even if it makes no sense.
Yeah. Then we get the Cathan attempted invasion of Lustria, which goes terribly. Once again, great for Harkin. Dark Elves start attacking like crazy. Potentially good for Harkin. But ultimately, he doesn't do a whole lot for a good while other than just kind of being a menace in the general area, mostly because of his madness. Harkin's different personalities, every time they are talked about by different writers, they're portrayed very differently, which is fitting. And they are wildly different. His personalities are extreme to the point where he's described in some that sometimes he has the personality of literally a babbling infant. Other times he believes himself to be like an eccentric general. Other times a great hero. Other times a terrible monster. Pretty much any eccentric performance you can think of is a personality of his, which is weird and very funny. And is also one of those things that's best left, I think, not too overly explored. But sometimes the real him peeks through. And those are usually the times where he gets shit done. He gathers to himself a court of necromancers, a court of vampires, who use sorcery, and he keeps them all very, very close because he cannot cast magic. He sucks it up, but he can't use it himself, which is one of the things that makes him such a, I think, beloved character for lore fanatics, is that he's so fucking unique. He's literally, on tabletop, he was running around with whatever the max magic resistance is, he has it. Whatever max is, he has it. If you're ever playing a roleplay game, magic should just not work on him at all. It should just bounce. If you can even use it near him, because he's just that much of a repellent.
Or a sock.
Yeah, vampires do really like to suck. Obviously, all the colonies start getting established, so we have tons and tons and tons and tons of people and humans coming to the area, which is when the Vampire Coast, as we understand it, would likely take the form we know it as.
Yeah,
would be around.
Make much more sense.
Yeah, wouldn't really be around till probably about 1500. I see is really when it would start to kick off and just grow more extreme, which is hilarious because he's been there for almost 1,000 years.
Yep. Go figure.
Yeah. What's interesting is that there's a couple other specific things I'll talk about, but I just want to finish with kind of the timeline specific stuff. Of the last time we really get to see him is one of the things that drives me crazy, but it's really funny, which is that in 2471, so 50 years before the end times, that's a long time ago, Harkin makes a friend, and his friend is Morathi. And not only does he strike a bargain with the Dark Elves, Morathi herself comes down to Lustria, which is not something she does a lot. A lot of people think she does. She really doesn't. She doesn't leave Nagaroth very often. But she actually physically came down and struck a bargain with Luthor Harkin, teamed up with him, and they attacked the ruins of Chocobox, which is a lizardman ruin that apparently had something very, very important in it for both Morathi and Harkin to want to really get in there. And with their powers combined, they are a unstoppable force. They plow through everything in their way. They get to the ruins. They sack it. But when they sack it, Luthor Harkin has one of his moments, his personality shift. And his new personality decides, fuck Morathi, screw this bitch. We're enemies now. And it doesn't go well for him, where he starts fighting the Dark Elves. And to be fair, Harkin proves to be enough of a menace that he can't just be killed outright because he's a bit of a problem, especially with the whole magic doesn't work on him thing. So Morathi does the next best thing, which is that instead of trying to kill him after he kills a bunch of Dark Elves and he's fighting his way towards her, she hilariously reactivates the wards of Chocobox, the Lizardman Temple City, and activates a barrier that traps him. So he gets stuck, and Morathi goes, oh, look, there's a giant army of lizardmen on their way from Slunhapek who are really irritated at us. Bye. And she just leaves. And Harkin is canonically captured by the lizardmen, but they don't kill him. And what's interesting is that this is the last mention in the timeline of Luthor Harkin, other than he escapes. But there's no mention of how he escapes, when he escapes, which I'm going to put a very crazy idea out there of, frankly, I think the lizardmen let him go.
Yeah, I agree completely. I don't just agree, I agree completely. It's quite clear that from the lore that we now have that's in place, that the old ones wanted the end times to occur. It was the point, and Harkin becomes a core component of the Nagash part of the end times. So you could argue that Luthor Harkin was being set up for what he would become much, much later. It's all part of the process. The old ones had a plan, and the lizardmen, in their, you could even argue in their stupidity, saw it through, because ultimately the old ones' plan was the destruction of everything that the lizardmen were attempting to protect.
Yeah, so there's a fun little storyline that is never explored, and I hate that it isn't, because it would make for such a fun moment of Harkin raving at the lizardman capturing him, the lizardman being like, no, this one needs it, kind of like how they let Thanquil go, of this one is important, we need to send him, we need to put him back in his little containment over there. The only other points that I want to point out before we get back to super chats, because there's a lot of them and we need to start getting through them, is that some other just fun notes about the Vampire Coast as a place, is that it is super nightmarish, not just because of the vampires and all the undead stuff, but it's very difficult to navigate. On top of there being a lot of really sharp rocks and nasty things, you have two volcanoes on the volcanic isles, the Fuming Serpent and the Spitting Serpent. Big old volcanoes. Fun fact, the Fuming Serpent is supposedly the volcano that Sotek the god was born out of and chased the Skaven across the ocean to the old world. But also there are several other places of interest. You also have New Beckhofen and Brion of settlements that humans live in, but vampires also live among them. There is my favorite note about New Beckhofen is that there is a temple of Mor with heavy quotation marks that is watched over by a batshit crazy tortured former priestess of Mor, but when you go into the temple, it's even designed to look like a temple of Mor. Instead of all of the things you would expect from a temple of Mor, it has a giant, beautiful statue of Luthor Harkin himself to be worshipped as a god. Because when he was in the mood where he decided to build it, he goes, the people must worship me, which you just love. He has a pretty awesome number of establishments. He has a castle over on the Volcanic Isle. He also has a major castle within, which is where he resides nowadays, within the Blood Swamps. He has a big old nasty black castle that's made from a form of black marble and obsidian, which is super spooky looking. That is reminiscent of what he remembers of his time in the Empire. So it has some pretty cool designs. And overall, it's just a menace in the area. But he's not the only one. There is another character that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition introduced that I actually really, really like. And the character that they introduced is a Cyrene character called the Brine Wife.
The Brine Wife. Now, although that was mentioned in previous books too, so it's not completely new.
I did not know that.
Yeah, the Brine Wife was popped up in, I think it might have been a White Dwarf first. Now, they might not have realized this because Brine Wife as a term is not exactly new, but Games Workshop had toyed with it in the past. So yeah, I agree. Nice, but not necessarily as new as you first think.
Yeah. The other thing is that, so her story is that she is a witch who fled from the Empire in the time of the Three Emperors, named Ketterlin, and she makes her way across the ocean, being pursued by a very nasty group of witch hunters that were just like, this bitch has got to die. Which sometimes witch hunters do that. They are a relentless sort. And she makes her way there, and there's a nasty thing that makes the Vampire Coast especially dangerous for explorers, which is known as the Sargassum. Or Sargassum, however you want to pronounce it. And the sargassum is a plant. It's a type of vine that grows from the continent of Lustria into the ocean, and you can't see it because it's deep down there, but it's this thick, grasping thing that just gets tangled up in ships, and it gets a hold of them, and it will never fucking let go, ever. Which is the main way that Harkin captures people, is that he doesn't have to do anything. They just get stuck in the sargassum because that leads to all the river entrances. So people see the inlets of the rivers to the their Corvesa River, and they think, oh, well, we're going to sail inland. We just got to go here. And then they get stuck. There's a very specific path you have to take through. And Harkin controls that path very diligently. Of that, if he likes you and you're caught in a particular catch him in a good mood, he'll allow you to pay tolls, essentially, to be guided by these undead ferrymen, which is just a cool idea. Where he'll let people pass through in exchange for giving him things that he wants. Without his help, you are not getting through it. You're just not, because those vines are that nasty. So anyway, Ketterlin, her ship gets trapped, and she tries to bargain with Harkin, but he's in one of his moods, and he captures her. And she's brought to his castle, which at the time was on the Volcanic Isles, and she has this whole epic conversation with him where she's showcasing her power. She was a very strong witch, really powerful, not like a chaos sorceress, but just a very powerful witch. And Harkin does one of my favorite things, which is that she's talking at him, and she says, allow me to serve you, allow me to be like a powerful sorcerer in your retinue, allow me to serve you. And Harkin gets a mood shift, and he goes, okay, you're right, I will let you serve me. And he hits her with the hypnotic gaze, because Harkin has hypnotic gaze because he's fucking scary. That's one of the scariest powers vampires can have. Hypnotic gaze is busted as fuck. In every medium it shows up in, it is a busted ass power. And he ties her up, and he performs a ritual to turn her into a siren, which involves him taking her up to the top, doing some horrible shit to her, and then he literally throws her off of the top of the castle so she drowns in the ocean. And she becomes a siren. But the problem was she was such a powerful witch, and her death was so bad that she turns into a siren, but she wasn't a regular siren. She was a siren that still had the ability to use magic, and she was pissed. Furious. She was a full-on revenant. And instead of being a faithful spirit he could control, she starts just wrecking shit. And Harkin goes, that's not what I wanted. Whoops. And she causes a lot of damage to that castle to the point where Harkin kind of shoos her off eventually. And she takes over that route through the sargassum. And Harkin, for a while, kept trying to send out like little admirals or vampires whose job was to be like his ruler of that area, the person, the duke of that area, so to speak. And the bride wife keeps assassinating them. So this siren was killing vampires after vampire after vampire. She's murdering them. And it got so bad that Harkin finally goes, fine, fuck it. You can have the job. Let's bargain. And he strikes a deal with her, and she becomes one of his most powerful allies. She still hates him, but she kind of works for him. And she's a very fun character, especially because she has a cave that has water and land in it, where whenever someone comes through her lands, she sings and they wreck, and she'll turn over the corpses to Harkin that he can do what he wants with, yada, yada. But a lot of the time she'll let people pass if they give her things that she wants. And the thing that I love about her character is she's obsessed with mirrors. She loves mirrors, and her cave, her home, is just full of them. And she just stares at them and talks to herself because her story is actually really sad. And I just love her. She's a fun character. She's great, especially because she's not strictly aligned with him. She's a reluctant ally at the best of times, which those are the best kinds of allies.
Yep.
Yeah. Other than that, super chats.
Super chats.
We left off here. Howdy, can't say for long since I'm working. I'm bad at reading people, so I may be off on this. But Andy, what are your thoughts on Celestia Deerfen? It seems to me like you don't like her.
I don't dislike her.
I don't think Andy he doesn't have a lot of experience with her, so I don't.
I require more XP in that particular front. I don't dislike her. I encountered her once and kicked her ass. But yeah, I don't dislike her. Come back to me in approximately 6 months and let's see what my opinion is by then.
There you go.
Whoa, wow.
Phil.
Boom.
What are the usual targets of the denizens of the Vampire Coast? Not that many civilizations over the New World, and those that aren't in the East is not correct. So soon they have to venture quite a way along the quarry in the Old World and beyond, which comes own set as risks. So perhaps they have networks and agents of their own making over there. Man, it's not easy being undead swashbuckler, let me tell you. So, that's a great question. Something that I actually love that Total War addresses much better, which is that the Vampire Coast is a global threat. They don't just sit in Lustria. They go out and they attack Talea, they attack Astalia, they attack the Border Princes and Bretonnia, the Empire. They ply the seas, which they should. They're fucking pirates, and they should be raiding places. And the colonies are great, but that shouldn't be their only source of antagonism. Pirates should be a global threat, you know, and I think that's how the Vampire Coast works best. And I will say that in the written lore, they antagonize mostly just the Lizardmen. They pretty much bully the Lizardmen and nobody else.
Yeah, the only time where they become a more general threat is during the end times.
Yeah, where they, oh, wow, look, they're a global threat now, which they should have been before that. You know, Harkin's been around there for almost 2,000 years. He should be attacking everywhere. He should be attacking the elven outposts, like the Citadel of Dawn and the Citadel of Dusk. He should be attacking Ulthuan if he, when he has those moments. The Vampire Coast is kind of one of those things where you definitely have the feeling of an author is writing a Lustria book and goes, oh, right, the Vampire Coast. Well, this is Lustria, so I'll just contain it to Lustria without thinking about the wider world. Where it's very likely the Vampire Coast, while they would be having their Lustria attacks, a lot of their stuff would be attacking literally everybody else. So thank God for Total War, because one of the things I love in Total War is they established the idea of Vampire Coast, what do they call them? The coast, they're not covens, coves, pirate coves, where the Vampire Coast pirates show up in settlements stealthily, and they set up their own little cabals where they're feeding on people, and they build a network within ports all around the old world so that they have people that are giving them information, feeding them info on where cargo ships will be going, feeding them info on merchant ships and armadas and things that they could attack. That makes so much fucking sense.
It doesn't just make sense, it reinforces exactly what the story of the Vampire Coast is, which is they are a universally whispered fear amongst all of the traders of the Warhammer world. But if you go by the official lore that we have, they're basically blank for hundreds of years. They're just this thing that lies there and occasionally attacks lizardmen and occasionally does something goofy, but doesn't really have anything in any way of a greater story. So yeah, Total War nails it in a way that the Warhammer setting and background just doesn't.
Yeah, like I'm literally sitting here praying that we get them in the old world at some point, because it would make them relevant to the old world, because they should be attacking the old world.
Yeah, tie it into Sartosa somehow, and you've got yourself a really cool thing that you could potentially build.
Yep. Where was I? Here. There's an old conspiracy theory in first edition Wolfrup that Teclis taught the 8 winds of magic to hobbles humanity's understanding of magic. Yep. In discussion earlier about all the different winds. Yeah. And that is something that is very heavily reinforced and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does.
BFG 40K, would the winds of magic be like the Chaos Gods? 4 main ones, but many others that exist. Except for there's like 8 main ones.
So like 8 winds of magic, but many others exist.
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
And I think that in the broader Warhammer world itself, we often there's various ways it could be manifest. 2 obvious ones is that there's magic that humans can't see because they are limited in their perceptions, in the same way that elves can see things that humans can't see, quite literally, because their vision has got a broader spectrum of acuity. So you could just simply say that there is magic they can't see, job done. Or alternatively, when the winds merge or unmerge, they don't necessarily just form Dar. They form other things that can be used and manipulated. A mixture of Gyron, for example, with Shyish, creating something that works particularly well from lore for the deep. There's lots of things you could do, loads of answers that you could put in. I've just thrown 2, but I think there are many more on top of that, and I think all of them are probably the case for the Warhammer world, particularly because it allows for a far broader understanding of how those 8 winds work, and also is supportive of and is supported by how the winds of magic work over in Cathay.
Yep. Peter, love the stream, guys. Hope you're both well. How did Harkin for the Pirate Coast? We talked about that earlier. And how often does he get challenged for Pirate King? that's actually a really fun question of vampires do often have wrestles for control. There would be the vampires and necromancers that would either try and kill Harkin or control him. And Harkin is just that fucking terrifying. He's fucking terrifying.
I think this is one of those ones where you've got yourself a character who lies at the heart of a particular empire who is not going to get challenged in any real sense with any great capability. And I think that is somewhat reproduced in various factions in the Warhammer world. Take, for example, the Dark Elves. Malekith holds that within his iron grip. And for all there are occasional attempts to politically outmaneuver him or whatever, Malekith is going to Malekith, or Malarian is going to Malarian. And in this particular case, there just is going to be no chance, regardless of the fact you've got magic ignores. He's freaking ancient. He comes up to you and does what vampires do, tears everything to shreds. Vampires are horrendously overpowered entities in the Warhammer world, particularly when they're old, particularly when they're powerful, and that is what Harkon is. There is almost no chance that anyone would have facing off against a properly statted version of him.
Yeah, Harkin's tabletop rules for the edition that he was in were actually pretty scary.
I actually can't remember the rules for him. It's been a while since I've read them.
Yeah, he's got more wounds than most vampires do. He also is able to get access to hatred and frenzy very easily, and he regenerates after he takes a little bit of damage. He's nasty.
Go. Yeah,
and he's magic resistant 3 and generated a lot of dispel dice just by existing. Nice. So he's pretty gnarly. Phil, on a lighter note, one of the most Anglo names, we actually talked about this earlier, making gunpowder really isn't that complex. There were examples of indigenous people that could make it during the conquest of the Americas. Yep. It's just dangerous and labor intensive. Oh, okay,
yep.
Cool, great. So
yep,
they probably make their own.
Yep, they make their own.
Sagemeister, any Arabian presence in the New World? They're meant to be great sailors, but it seems strange that every other nation has the luxury and foothold, but not them. Should they be there? Yes, 100% undeniably. Are they? Not in any official writing, because Games Workshop doesn't like to talk about them.
But Games Workshop doesn't like anything that doesn't come from the old world because they're afraid of being accused of being racist. And what often happens is because they ignore the rest of the world, they end up making everything very white and super racist. It's an absolute catch-22 of a position that is of their own creation. I was in a position where I could detail some extra bits and pieces for a book. I won't say which one. I sent off the request, I want to do this, and I was told roundly, yeah, no, don't do that. We're literally, we don't discuss that because we haven't figured out how we want to do that yet to avoid being called racist. And I was like, this is how you do it. Like this. It'll work. It's fine. And they're like, no, just eradicate all of it so we just don't discuss it at all. Meaning that the piece came across as super, super white and weird. So, yeah, that's why there's no strong Arabian presence. Although you'll find that in individual army lists, they pop up every once in a while as a single entry. Or in individual stories, you'll get a single entry, but it's never really given the detail it properly deserves.
Yeah, go watch my proposal video for why Arabic should be in Total War. Because Total War... it makes GW a little braver every time. They make them a little braver.
Yep, agreed.
Lord Eisen, hey, I'll just received my copy of Dark Deeds, but also by pure dumb luck, I came across a hardback copy of Liber Chaotica for dirt cheap. Dang, look at you.
Nice. I like it, Lord Eisen.
You swindled somebody.
Yeah, you go sell that on eBay and you probably make yourself an enormous profit. But personally, I'd keep the book.
Oh, yeah, it's a great book. Great book.
Yeah, great book.
Ricky, thank you very much. I finally managed to catch a live moment. Thank you for your all this. Oh, we appreciate that, Ricky. Thank you so much. Warzags, what is the relationship between Noctilus and Arnessa? Bad. Very bad. Arnessa hated Noctilus. She had a run-in with him but in an earlier part of the story, before the actual Dreadfleet thing. She despises him. She hates him big time. Especially Arnessa is very much, in her personal story, she is a daughter of Manon in a very literal sense, and she takes that very seriously. Like, she is a devout worshiper of Manon, and Manon has no tolerance for Noctilus. Fire Snakes, did he break the Nexus point at least? In Huatl, it's not exactly clear. He maybe. In the lore that discusses that, it talks about that Axolotl becomes the next major priority. So the answer seems to be yes, but he wasn't able to take good advantage of it.
Yeah, I imagine it was probably disturbed in such a fashion that it no longer works, but if you got yourself a particularly savvy individual, it could be re-established.
Isaac, you once said that Harkin would beat Manfred in a 1v1. Do I stand by that? What Andy's take? I don't know what the fuck Past Me was talking about, because I think Past Me was an idiot. Because I would say no, Harkin would lose because Manfred is bonkers.
Yeah.
Like, I imagine Past Me was like, oh, well, he wouldn't be able to use magic, but Manfred doesn't need magic to kick your ass, to be frank.
Yeah, Manfred is rock hard. And I would also add that for all you don't have magic you can use directly against him, you can still use magic against him. Classic examples are, I will pick up this rock and throw it at you. That's magic.
Yeah.
You can't dispel a freaking rock, and that's going to hit you in the face. And Manfred is a fine example of a deeply, extraordinarily powerful sorcerer. He understands magic in a way that most simply do not, and has studied it across the world in corners that most people would never expect to find. A Manfred von Karstein walking by going, "Hi, just passing through to study your magic. I'll be back later." As off he goes. Yeah, I think that that this is a little bit like the old fight between two immovable forces, obviously, because Harkin is a mentalist.
Yeah, it would be a fight. Don't get me wrong. It would be
one
a fight.
hell of a fight. But if I was to put basic odds in it, I would say most of the time Manfred would get the better of it. That doesn't mean he beats him in a close-up combat. It means he gets the better of the situation because he's exceedingly intelligent, exceedingly capable, and would take on Harkin in the way that would most likely allow him to succeed.
Yeah, and the big thing with Harkin is that his personality changing can help him, but most of the time it's a detriment to him. And that would be huge in Manfred's favor. You know, Manfred doesn't have to deal with the stress of that. Whereas Harkin could quite literally be in a fight and basically have the issue that trolls have, where he gets a personality shift and he doesn't know where he is.
Yeah.
It's like, if you want to look at Harkin in a very tragic sense, he basically has hardcore vampire dementia, of that he literally will have moments where he'll just sort of blink and he doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know what he's doing. Normally when he's in a fight, he's able to focus and that kind of keeps him on board. But in a fight against someone like Manfred would heavily want to take advantage of that. Burmatail, thank you for engaging my ADHD so I can do chores. You're welcome.
Always happy to help a fellow ADHD individual.
Yeah. Mornington Crescent, retechnology. One thing we forgot is that technology in the real world doesn't just march forward. Things are forgotten, things are suppressed, and things say dwarf engineers suppress black powder repeatedly after disasters. Yeah, very true.
Yeah, and I agree with this, Mornington Crescent. That's why I suggested that the best way to deal with it is to have it be found and lost at multiple times, allowing for and also to be imported from different directions, allowing for the very many contradictory versions of the background to marry together, hopefully relatively neatly.
Yep, Ricky Chapman fell asleep. Sorry, you don't need to apologize. According to the Dogs of War, the Lizardmen hired the Lost Legion to kill zombies from the Vampire Coast. Do they have to get others to attack the undead? They have the goal to do it. Sometimes, yeah. That was actually one of the really fun things about the Dogs of War that got lost a bit when Games Workshop was like, oh, this is too silly, we need to get rid of it. Was how many times you got to see really bizarre team-ups and factions interacting in ways that helped made the world feel more alive and interesting. Of them being like, oh, look, we got Tichi Huichi's Lost Raiders. How are other factions going to hire them? And they go with this crazy fun story of how the Slann is literally like mind manipulating people from a continent away. Or you have this idea of Pizarro's Lost Legion hanging around in Lustra and the Lizardmen being like, hey, here's gold, go kill those guys. Which works well and makes for fun storytelling. The Lizardmen, contrary to a lot of the broad aspects, they are capable of diplomacy. They do deal with other races.
Yeah.
And there are skinks that can speak a surprisingly massive list of languages. They often speak very archaic versions of it, but they speak it. And you have like Marco Colombo, canonically, still to this day, has a whole bunch of experiences with the Lizardmen. And you have the same thing with the likes of, I would say, Pizarro's Lost Legion being hired to fight Luthor Harkin. Yeah, great, awesome.
Yep, agreed. And again, try not to think of the Lizardmen as purely that single example as they describe those cold individual fishes. Go dive into our Tehenoan stream if you want to get an idea of how the Lizardmen have been, let's say, almost forcibly moved from one type of species into a new type by the rising of Sotek. So go check that one out to get some different ideas for how lizardmen could be used, because it was a good stream.
Yeah, and there are absolutely forces that, you know, would be interested in hiring people to fight the vampire ghosts and the lizardmen, to the high elves, dark elves.
High elves in particular.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of people that would not like them. Tradition, any secret of Monkey Island influence on the vampire coast? I don't know. I would say it'd be silly of them not to. It's such a legendary series. But I don't know how popular it was over in the UK versus how popular it was in the States.
Yeah, it's pretty popular over here. Yeah, it was pretty popular over here. And I'm going to guess that anybody who was into adventure games of my era, so back when the very first Monkey Island games were coming out, will have played them. And my age group are the people who are writing the lore back there in the studio, and I know a few of those folks, and they're definitely the type who would have played the game. So do I think that it was an influence? I think definitely. In fact, I could ask. It almost certainly probably was. As to how much, I think you'll find that in terms of the modern Vampire Coast, Pirates of the Caribbean is significantly more of an influence than the Secrets of Monkey Island these days.
Yeah, I think actually if you go read the White Dwarf article that introduced the Vampire Coast army list, it very much it feels, it has that vibe. Like there's a strong comedy streak through the original army list when they're talking about everything from like the deck droppers are so stupid. Total War took them seriously, of the giant bats carrying zombies in their claws with guns who are shooting as they're flying around, which is the dumbest fucking thing I've ever seen. But like Total War's like, yeah,
than a Doom Diver or a Squig Hopper? Not really.
I guess, but man, it looks fucking silly.
It does.
So there very much is that aspect of the faction. There's a Monkey Island reference in Final Fantasy 14. Thank you, Knowles. Of course he can.
Of course he can.
But oh, nice, we got caught up.
Oh,
so
holy heck.
Yeah, that is a lot of the general big strokes of the Vampire Coast. Probably this is really one of those streams where I don't often think about it in this way until I'm forced to sit down and talk about it, which is why I love Lorebeards so much. Of that, the Vampire Coast, amusingly, until Total War, grossly underutilized, and frankly, just doesn't make sense from a timeline perspective. It just doesn't.
It doesn't. No, I agree completely. If you take a look at the lore that exists as it currently sits, you pop through all of the various books and what they discuss about the Vampire Coast, and most of them are set in the modern era. And most of them take the modern era's perspective, but when you hark back to the earlier stuff, they pretty much assume... they pretty much assume that the Warhammer world as it is in the late 2500s, in the early 2500s, is the same as it was in the 800s, 900s, 1000s, up to 1300s. And it simply wasn't. Meaning that we've got ourselves a faction that has formed out of nothing, is supported by nothing, and has 1,000 years of nothing to keep it in place. It really doesn't make any sense at all when you examine it with any depth. However, I don't think it's in any way impossible to make sense of. It's a location which has a super cool character at the heart of it, a character that has directly involved itself with the old ones, a character that later also directly involves itself with the Dark Elves too, and probably has close interactions with Skaven and High Elves and more. A faction that, when you read it in terms of how it moves towards the end times, quite clearly has, by its modern version, spread outwards and is piratically raiding across the ocean, the Great Ocean, and it is everywhere, doing all sorts of horrific things. But nevertheless, the grounding point of it from the beginning doesn't make any sense, and it's one that you just feel that someone should sit down and go, once upon a time, Luthor Harkin arrived in Lustria. This is what he was like. This is how he took it from this weird beginning This is how he got his first undead. This is how he managed to get the corpses to gather here. This is the great rituals that he started to use as more ships began to pass by to draw them in over the course of the centuries, and then weave that into the Old One artifacts, into Skaven attacks, into the Dark Elves, into the arrival of colonists, into all of the cool stories there, and then eventually him losing it completely for that mixture of, again, Old One, it's not really Old One influence, it's Lizardman influence, and the Old One artifacts in the area, plus the enormous quantity of dark magic as well that's being dealt with, and turning into this almost goofy version of what he would once have almost certainly looked at what he became in the future. He would hate it. This goofy pirate king that has lost his mind. And how that matches Warhammer in a way that many parts of the Warhammer world doesn't, because it takes itself so seriously. This is a horrific tale of an ancient, powerful entity that has lost its mind and has turned everyone into a gigantic chorus of Pirates of the Caribbean zombies, with enormous crazy things dragging stuff from across the world and pulling it back as he sits on his giant pile of doubloons. This is a character that needs its background to be expanded, because when you eventually got a cool version of it in Total War, you couldn't help but by the end of playing that going, holy fuck sticks, these are awesome. They feel Warhammer. They completely feel Warhammer. Yes, Warhammer on the goofier side, but they're still nevertheless truly horrific, terrifying, absolutely awful. Warhammer shines in that lovely sweet spot between the goofy, the strange, and the horrific, and it very much takes that. And then when you add that to a character who perhaps had a different background, particularly if we do lean on, say, Abarash and give him maybe even a noble background, perhaps there was something he was trying to do. Perhaps there was something big he was trying to do. And then you get that conflicting with the prophecies that he comes face to face with, and how the Lizardmen manipulate him into this horror show, an absolute horror show, which is great to watch from the outside, because who doesn't like gigantic undead pirates? They're freaking cool. But from his perspective, it is a complete loss and erosion of all of his character, everything that he ever was, everything he ever wanted to be, and he has turned into nothing more than a tool to be used by ancient plaques that the Lizardmen don't understand. And there's a really nice story hiding behind the scenes there that I really wish had been told.
Yeah, there's a really fascinating... so the first thing I want to say, because I'm going to forget if I don't now, is that one of the things I agree with Andy is that the Vampire Coast as a whole, the place especially, can have such a wonderful, fascinating story told that I'm really disappointed that the Cubicle 7 book didn't really even try to deal with, which is that the Vampire Coast could be so much cooler than it already is, looking at Luthor Harkin and its history, if you go, okay, so the original Vampire Coast was made up of Norscan raiders. So what did that look like? Imagine these Viking longships of zombies and skeletons and vampires, and how they evolved over centuries to taking up things like black powder, to seizing hilariously an Empire Hell cannon, whatever it's called, and turning it into Queen Bess, which is this stupidly fucking Titanic cannon that Harkin himself messes around with. Of that, when he has his lucid moments, he's tinkering with engineering hilariously. Of, showcasing the genius of Harkin in his good moments of advancing, which makes him very different from a lot of vampires who tend to be very stuck in the past, tend to be very, just using the tricks and tools that they know and not really advancing as technology does. But Harkin, either due to his personality quirks or just due to who he is, actively progresses his armies. Or if he discovers a new technology, oh, we need that. We need those cannons. I want more cannons. Oh, look at that big Hellhammer cannon. I want that. Or, oh, look at these like new types of vessels. I want those. Gunpowder. Give me all that. Like, there's such a fascinating thing there. And then, like Andy said, that I also heavily agree with, you could tell a beautiful, amazing short story that's focused on someone like a captive or a high elf or someone interviewing Harkin and seeing how horrifying what's been done to him is. Of like, yeah, he's a monster and he's a vampire lord. He's always been a kind of a piece of shit. But like, if you're willing to look at the humanity beneath that, of someone who's had his literal mind stripped away from him, of having these scenes of him, like he has a he has a tick and he flies off in a rage and he's screaming and yelling at someone that's not there, to another tick and he's like really sad and mopey and depressed, to another one and he's basically like a mewling child, to another one where he thinks he's a woman that has this other situation, to another one where he thinks some hero. And then at the end of the story, you get a tick where the actual Harkin comes through and he knows what he is. Like, he has that moment of like someone with, a progressive mental disease that's eating away at their brain, coming out of that fog for a moment and like looking at who he's talking to and being like, I know what's happened to me. Like, I can't control it, but I know. Yeah. And like how tragic that would be, of just like having a horrible, monstrous villain of you looking at him going, holy fuck, I feel terrible for this guy. And he's immortal. He can't die. He's just stuck like this.
And Warhammer always works at its best, as I said earlier in the stream, when it's dealing with those shades of grey, when it's not simply making bad guys that are cackling evil bad guys, or it's making good guys that are noble, pure and heroic. And what we've got here is a bad guy, because he's a bad guy, who is at his face value goofy, over the top and ridiculous, but is a bad guy that if we were to get the stories that he quite clearly deserves, would be tragic. And tragic possibly on multiple layers, not just from the entity that he was to what he's become, but even the vampiric story that lies behind that, and the entity he was to begin to the vampire he had become after that. There is a great story that hasn't been told. If you're looking for one of the missing stories of Warhammer, it is his. I would suggest, of all the stories of Warhammer that I've seen that are largely missing, Luthor Harkin has one of the biggest, and sadly the End Times version, when it came up, did nothing more than pose more questions. Who the fuck is he anyway? What the hell's going on? Why is he doing this? Where did he come from? Why is he like this? We need more detail. But by the time the End Times was tackling things, it wasn't in any way there to add to the story. It was supposed to be ending the story, but it didn't, because it gave us more story. As is often the case with the End Times, one of the writers would come along and go, well, I'm going to add my cool new thing in now. So rather than resolve existing core stories out there, they just added more stuff, and not always good stuff, replacing old stuff that was possibly good stuff. And Luthor Harkin in this case needed more to be properly used by the End Times, didn't get it. So instead what we have is this tantalizingly close character who is so super cool, who Total War has picked up and gone, look, this character is cool. And then you look at it and go, why? And find out that all you're left with is, because Warhammer Pirate Zombies, yeah! And you're left going, that sucks, because this is a tragic tale sitting right in front of my face that no one seems to perceive. He is a figure that not only represents very real world issues of things like dementia, mental disease, mental illness in a variety of different forms, but he also represents the age-old tale of Warhammer, because he's been there for a good 2,000 years kicking about doing stuff, and possibly longer. What if Morathi decided that she was coming along to do her thing purely because she'd met him previously? There's tales that could be told there, and Morathi can add a very interesting, unique angle to it, because she eventually allies with him, trusting this lunatic for one reason or another. Why the hell did she come down to meet him? It makes zero sense, unless, of course, there's history. And she's a character who can have history with vampires. So we've got tales to tell.
Yeah, I mean, even going with the continuation of like the Lizardman letting him go of, oh, it's part of the great plan, but you could also go, what if there's a personality of Harkin that's an ally to the Lizardman?
Yeah.
And there's a relationship there that is unexplored. Of Harkin has some potential if somebody, like the amount you could do there is insane that nobody's really messed with. I mean, and that's even before getting into the Vampire Coast as a place of that Harkin's been there for so long. It's almost, once again, it's a little silly that New Beckhoff and the Ruins of Brionne are really the only thing he has. He would probably have an empire of like cities and other settlements and colonies of, Wolfrip, because of the limited number of pages and such, took a very simple view of like, oh, it's a very obvious evil haunted place.
Yeah, I was pretty.
Well, what if it would be more interesting if these colonies were more hidden, more like luring, actually inviting people in, not realizing.
I don't like discussing what the later versions of fantasy roleplay did, because it feels like I'm criticizing things that I didn't do. And the things that I could have done. So I don't like directly criticizing these things. I generally just say, this is what was done. I might have maybe done it differently and kind of leave it off there. But this is an example where there was an epic tale that could have easily been told over 4 or 5 pages. Easily told over 4 and 5 pages. It's astonishing how much you can squeeze into that amount of space. I managed to get an entire playable species in 5 pages at the back of a single roleplay book with the gnomes. And I changed them completely from the ground to the very sky, massively rewrote them and gave them a history. And that was with full rules as well. If you cut out all the rules, you can really fill something like that with beautiful, crisp details, little asides, lovely quotations that just make it sing. And I remember when I looked through it going, oh well, at least they did something. But it just didn't feel like they did anything to enhance it, to really make it the epic story of, let's be honest, how many parts of the Warhammer world, if you look around, are named by a character? Just take a moment. The Vampire Coast is his. How many parts of the Warhammer world can you say, well, that's that character's bit? There are surprisingly few. Nagaroth, that's clearly Malekith's bit. Then we start breaking down. The Empire isn't created and bound for over 1,000 years by a single individual. That's not Sigmar's bit. He's dead and gone, or arisen, whatever you wish to say. Luthor Harkin has got this unique, massive influence in Lustria, and sadly the story doesn't quite land that.
Yep. Yeah, and my own big dagger throw at that book. Luthor Harkin's profile, it's already not great. You have to buff
his
it.
Profile in there.
Oh yeah,
I can't remember. I don't even want to look at it.
Use it. You have to buff the living hell out of it. But the thing that made me really upset, he doesn't have any magic resistance. he has no anti-magic properties whatsoever. It's like, oh come on, that's like his one big gimmick.
Yeah.
They forgot it. But Godzilla 2021. While it's only a total war, there's a building that describes skinks selling Crocscore labor. Them instructing Crocscore for construction or other hard labor jobs for other races in exchange for money or plaques. Yeah, super fun idea. It's very much a total warism, but I see no reason why it couldn't have popped up in other places.
I agree with that completely, because the skinks aren't stupid. If they've got something that they want, in the end, it's all about resources. Resources grant power. Power grants you the ability to get what you want. If you want those golden plaques and you can't take them by directly taking them because the other party is either too powerful or it'll cost you too much resources to take it, and they are willing to trade, and you say, I want that plaque, and they say, what do you have? Well, I've got muscle. I think that this is absolutely something that could and should happen. They often try to keep each of the various factions discreet, and when they make them discreet, they make them less interesting, because they forget that when neighbors sit beside each other, they interact, and it isn't always war. And indeed, having the lizardmen always choose war, in some respects, weaken them and makes them look particularly foolish.
Yep. Singemeister, Citadel of Dawn, South African eating yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. Also, okay, this is actually, I do want to address this. Why did CA make a new Siren character for the Vampire Coast being Celestia Deerfen instead of the Siren Lady Luthor turn? Because this book came out afterwards, and in many respects they should have looked to Total War and gone, hey, there's some stuff there I can use, rather than what appears to be the case where they just made up some extra bits. The Prime Wife's cool, but like Celestia Deerfen would have been even cooler.
Much cooler. I agree completely. It would have been so much cooler if they had taken the existing lore that was out there and adapted it. It wouldn't be very difficult. The relationship that the licensors have with each other is really strong. There is no issue with using CA stuff when you're doing the roleplay game, as long as you ask. So super, super cool. It's a bit of a shame that wasn't done.
Yep. But we're out of time. We're actually over time a little bit.
We over time. Well, there we go. My conclusion on that is go buy Dark Deeds. I think that is the obvious conclusion to any stream about vampires. Go buy Dark Deeds. You can do so right now from your local
Dark Deeds.
And it will be shipped immediately, but more realistically, I love the Vampire Coast ever since I first saw it, all the way back in the Undead Army list. It's the first time I actually paid attention to it, and I went, I wonder what the fuck that is. And there was a single timeline entry saying, that thing that you wonder what the fuck that is, there's a vampire. His name's Luthor, a classic Warhammer vampire name, Luthor Harkin. And he's over there, and he has been for, and I remember thinking, holy shitballs, that's like forever. That's like 1,800 years he's been there. What the? What
he makes the von Karstein president of the Empire look baby.
Yeah, totally.
There's so long.
And I was like, well, that's different. I'm really looking forward to learning more about that. And then when the Lustrian Army list came out later, and it was quite a bit later, all the way up to 1997, so we're looking at 3 years afterwards. So that was for the Lizardmen. And the Lizardmen Army list gave us our first paragraph, or it was like 3 or 4 paragraphs worth of detail about it. It was more than enough to go, yeah, they've got a thing there. This is a story that one day will be told. And the undead weren't so focused on vampire counts and Nekara's dry undead from the south, and that's all we're really going to discuss. At that point, it was just undead. And I was strongly of the expectation that a later undead army list would come out and you would have different factions available, and Luthor Harkin would be a special character for Warhammer right there. That never happened.
Hey, look, Andy predicted Total War Warhammer almost 30 or 20 years before it came out.
Yeah, it just never happened. And I remember the separation of the undead into the separate groups being, for me, a bit of a disappointment, because they didn't separate into the groups and really add an enormous amount to the lore, although Thomas Prinnan, when he did all the vampire accounts, did add quite a bit there. Feeling very Vampire the Masquerade in terms of how it's presented. But we lost parts of the undead in the Warhammer world. Indeed, I would argue that the splitting of the army lists from being undead to being different types of undead lessened the undead in the entirety of the Warhammer world and made everybody think vampires, lands of the dead, forgetting that undead are everywhere in Warhammer. Everywhere. And that when we move over to the east, we should have undead there. When we move over into the various parts of the old world, that lie beyond the old world, we need to have variations of the undead everywhere. The wind of death and Dar is everywhere.
Yeah, to be clear, just to add a specific, what Andy is saying is not just like, oh, like Nagash stuff. Like, no, it should be like things completely separated from Nagash.
Absolutely. Nagash is one source of this, but not the only one. And I feel that Warhammer has lost something through this particular period. Fortunately, Total War has come along and taken those scraps of lore, pulled it back together, and given us something that I think is genuinely great. I just wish that a writer could come along and take this genuinely great face that we've got and show the entire depth that lies behind it. But as it currently stands, we don't have that yet. But we can hope that one day that it comes.
Yeah. Anyway. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we'll hope and pray to whatever gods you believe in that maybe one day there'll be an old world faction. That would be cool.
That would be cool.
Like, I mean, there's still parts of the old world I get quite excited for, like the fact that the Warriors of Chaos book, they're featuring Gal Roch as one of the 2 Warrior of Chaos characters. Very exciting.
Cool. I got a question for you before you go. Are you intending on moving on to another stream right after this where you're going to be reviewing the new patch?
No, because I'm gonna make that a video, and I also am hungry.
Yeah, me too. So that being the case, I think it's time for us to go get food. Oh no, there is one other thing to say. Next Sunday, we've got the topic already organized. Have you checked to see who won?
Pretty sure I know.
I'm pretty sure I know as well. We should go check just to make sure it's not what I think it is.
Just make sure nothing crazy happened.
Yeah, where is it? I think you're going to get to it before I am. Oh, here we go.
Let's see. I gotta scroll down.
My channel, isn't it?
Scroll down. It is the old ones.
What a surprise.
Yeah.
So that's this coming Sunday at 4 p.m. UK and at all your various local times. We will be discussing the old ones. What the hell are they? Where did they come from? What are they doing? And when they say in silvered ships they did come, Did they actually just arrive in big silver spaceships, or does that mean something a little bit deeper? You will find out.
Oh man,
Sunday.
I need to get my mind out of the gutter. But
oh, I just realized where you were going. Yes, you do.
Also, be sure to join us this Wednesday for our first Total War stream.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be awesome. That's this Wednesday.
Yeah, we have figured out some potential faction votes. They're not binding necessarily. We may change our minds. I was watching an Andy stream where he cheekily revealed one of the options being Elspeth von Draken and Morgiana LaFay.
Yeah.
But I will give y'all another potential option we might do.
What's the next one?
Which will be Ikit Claw, played by Andy Klein Scryer, and Sotek picking up Morgar the Shadowgave.
Oh, that's going to be a good pair. So that's two of the pairs that we're considering so far. We have a third pair, which we're also considering, which we will tell you about on the Wednesday. It's going to be super fun. So looking forward to seeing you all on the Wednesday stream. And you can make it. That's currently scheduled for 11 p.m., I believe. Is that the case? So 11 p.m. UK time, which is, I'm going to presume, sometime during the day, your local time.
Yeah, 5 p.m. CST, 11 p.m. BST.
Yeah, it's going to be super fun.
Yeah, the only other thing, we'll see you next week on Sunday. And for the week after that, we might do something special that I have to talk about, Andy, after the stream. Because
looking forward to that too.
You'll find out. Anyway, we're going to get out of here. Thank you all so much for watching.
We'll see you all later. Until next time. Bye-bye.